causal loop is a situation where an event is both the cause and the effect of itself. It creates a self-sustaining circle in time, where one event directly leads to another, and then that second event loops back to trigger the first one. This phenomenon is commonly discussed in the context of time travel and has fascinated scientists, philosophers, and storytellers for decades. Imagine a scenario to better understand this. A person named Jane travels back in time with the goal of helping her younger self succeed in life. I'd love to invite you to share in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is. It's incredible to think about how we're all connected through these stories and ideas. If you enjoy these thought-provoking explorations, consider subscribing to Tired Thinker so we can keep bringing you reflective narratives. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and let your imagination drift as we delve into the mind-boggling paradoxes and mysteries. While in the past, Jane gives her younger self a book full of advice and strategies. Her younger self uses the book, follows its guidance, and grows up to achieve great success. Years later, Jane decides to write a book of her own based on her life experiences. She realizes her younger self could benefit from the book and travels back in time to deliver it. The problem is that Jane's book is filled with the very advice she received from her older self. The book has no clear origin. It exists solely because Jane introduced it to her younger self, who then wrote the same book later in life. This creates a loop where the book exists without any external cause, defying normal expectations of cause and effect. This type of paradox is sometimes referred to as a Bootstrap Paradox. The name comes from the idea of pulling yourself up by your bootstraps, an impossible task that mirrors the circular logic of a causal loop. In this case, an object, idea, or event exists because it is brought into the past, yet its existence in the past is entirely dependent on its presence in the future. It's a mind-bending concept because it challenges our understanding of how time and causality should work. Causal loops raise questions about determinism and free will. If someone is caught in a causal loop, do they have any real agency, or are they simply fulfilling a predetermined role in a chain of events? Take, for example, the story of a scientist who invents a time machine after discovering detailed blueprints in their mailbox. The blueprints are signed by an unknown author, so the scientist assumes they were sent by a brilliant colleague. They build the machine, use it to travel back in time, and then realize they were the ones who placed the blueprints in their own mailbox in the first place. This means the invention of the time machine was inevitable. The scientist never truly invented it, but simply carried out a process dictated by the loop. This raises the unsettling idea that in such scenarios, free will might not exist. Every action is part of the loop, and the loop itself is self-perpetuating. Now consider the implications for identity and existence. Suppose someone travels back in time and becomes their own grandparent, as in the classic time travel thought experiment. This person would exist because of their own actions, creating a cycle in which their lineage has no true starting point. It's an unsettling concept because it defies the linear progression of time and challenges our understanding of cause and effect. In essence, the person's existence becomes a closed loop with no external explanation or origin. The idea of causal loops also touches on the nature of information and knowledge. Imagine a situation where a future scientist sends detailed instructions for curing a disease back to their younger self. The younger version follows these instructions, develops the cure, and then years later sends the same instructions back in time. In this loop, the information about the cure exists, but it has no original source. It's not the result of independent discovery or research. It simply perpetuates itself. This raises profound questions about the origins of knowledge and whether it's possible for information to exist without a clear starting point. Causal loops are not just limited to science fiction. They are also a topic of debate in theoretical physics. Some interpretations of time travel suggest that causal loops could exist within certain frameworks, such as Einstein's theory of general relativity. According to this theory, space and time are interconnected, and under certain extreme conditions, like those near a black hole, time could theoretically bend back on itself. These closed time-like curves, as physicists call them, could create conditions for causal loops. However, these ideas remain speculative, as we currently lack the technology and understanding to test them in reality. Another fascinating aspect of causal loops is their potential to preserve consistency in the timeline. Some argue that, within a causal loop, events are fixed and cannot be altered. This means that no matter how many times a person travels back in time, they will always act in a way that ensures the loop is maintained. For instance, if someone tries to prevent a historical event, their actions may inadvertently cause it to happen. This is known as the Predestination Paradox. In such cases, the loop acts as a self-correcting mechanism, ensuring that history unfolds as it always has. To explore this further, consider a scenario where a historian travels back in time to witness a famous event, like the signing of a peace treaty. While observing, the historian accidentally knocks over a lamp, causing a fire that disrupts the proceedings. In the chaos, the treaty is signed earlier than planned, exactly as recorded in history. The historian's attempt to remain an observer ends up being the very cause of the event they came to witness. This reinforces the idea that the loop cannot be broken, no matter how hard someone tries to change it. Causal loops also raise ethical and philosophical questions. If someone finds themselves in a loop, are they obligated to act in a certain way to preserve the timeline? Or should they attempt to break free, even if it risks creating a paradox? The answers depend on one's perspective on fate and free will. Some might argue that maintaining the loop is necessary to preserve the fabric of reality, while others might see the loop as a constraint that must be overcome. Despite their complexities, causal loops remain a compelling idea in both fiction and science. They challenge our understanding of time, causality, and existence, forcing us to reconsider what we believe to be possible. While they may seem paradoxical, they offer a unique lens through which to explore the nature of reality and the potential consequences of time travel. Whether or not causal loops can exist in the real world, they continue to spark curiosity and inspire new ideas about the mysteries of time. The predestination paradox is a fascinating concept in time travel, where actions intended to prevent an event inadvertently cause the very event they were meant to stop. This idea challenges our intuitive understanding of cause and effect. It suggests that time is not a malleable thread we can easily reshape, but rather a tightly woven tapestry where any attempt to adjust one part simply reinforces the existing design. Imagine someone traveling back in time to prevent a catastrophic event, such as a war. Their intentions are noble. They may believe that by intervening, they can save countless lives and change the course of history for the better. However, the very act of traveling back and taking those actions sets off a chain of events that lead directly to the war they hope to stop. For example, imagine a diplomat from the future who knows that a specific treaty failure sparked a global conflict. Believing they can prevent this, they travel to the past to ensure the treaty is signed. However, their presence and interference make the negotiators suspicious, creating tension that ultimately causes the treaty to collapse and the war to begin. The paradox lies in the idea that the attempt to prevent the war was the catalyst for its occurrence. This paradox operates on the principle that the timeline is self-consistent. In other words, all events, even those involving time travel, fit seamlessly into the historical narrative. If someone traveled back in time, their actions would not alter history in a way that creates contradictions. Instead, their actions would have always been a part of history. This means the very reason they traveled back in time was a result of their own actions in the past. It's a loop that feeds into itself, creating an unbreakable cycle. Consider a more personal example. A person learns that a fire will destroy their childhood home in the past. Fueled by a deep sense of guilt and the desire to protect their family, they travel back in time to warn them. Upon arriving, they try to convince their younger self and their parents to leave the house, but their panicked behavior causes confusion. In the chaos, they accidentally knock over a candle that starts the fire. The fire that shaped their life and led them to time travel in the first place was caused by their own attempt to stop it. This is the essence of the predestination paradox. An event cannot be undone because it is already part of the timeline. At the heart of the paradox is the question of free will. If someone's actions in the past are predetermined by the future they come from, do they truly have the freedom to change events? In a predestination paradox, every choice made by the time traveler seems to be an illusion. They are bound by the timeline, even if they believe they are acting of their own volition. Their decisions align perfectly with the events that have already occurred, creating the sense that the timeline itself is guiding their actions. This deterministic view of time can be unsettling. It suggests that no matter how much effort someone puts into changing the past, they are ultimately playing out a script that has already been written. A notable example of the predestination paradox can be found in popular culture. In the movie The Terminator, the character Kyle Reese travels back in time to protect Sarah Connor from an assassin sent by machines from the future. During his time in the past, Reese and Sarah develop a relationship, and Sarah becomes pregnant with John Connor, the future leader of the human resistance. John sends Reese back in time because he is his father, completing a loop in which the very act of protecting Sarah ensures John's existence. Reese's journey to the past does not change history, it fulfills it. The paradox here lies in the fact that the future resistance leader would not exist without the time travel that was meant to secure his survival. The predestination paradox also raises questions about accountability and responsibility. If a time traveler's actions in the past are integral to the timeline, can they be held responsible for the outcomes they inadvertently cause? For instance, in the earlier example of the fire, the traveler's actions were driven by the desire to save their family. Their intentions were pure, yet they caused the disaster. Should they be blamed for starting the fire, or does the timeline itself bear some responsibility? These questions challenge our understanding of morality and agency when applied to the fluid nature of time. Another interesting aspect of the paradox is its relationship with knowledge. In many cases, the time traveler's actions are based on information from the future. They act on what they know, but their knowledge often becomes the very trigger for the events they wish to avoid. Imagine a scientist in the future discovers a catastrophic environmental collapse and travels back to warn people. Their warnings lead to panic, and governments implement drastic policies that unintentionally accelerate the collapse. The scientist's knowledge of the future became a self-fulfilling prophecy. The paradox highlights the danger of incomplete understanding and the unintended consequences of acting on limited information. This concept also aligns closely with the idea of fate. In a predestination paradox, events seem to follow a predetermined path, as though guided by an invisible hand. The time traveler's actions, no matter how well-intentioned, are not random. They align with the flow of time, reinforcing the idea that everything is meant to happen as it does. This deterministic view can be both comforting and disconcerting. On one hand, it suggests that the timeline is resilient and self-correcting. On the other, it implies that individual efforts to change the past are futile. Despite its inherent complexity, the predestination paradox offers a fascinating lens through which to view time travel. It challenges us to rethink our understanding of cause and effect, free will, and the nature of time itself. In many ways, it serves as a reminder of the interconnectedness of events. Actions have consequences, and those consequences are often more far-reaching and complex than we can predict. Ultimately, the predestination paradox paints a picture of time as an intricate, unyielding web. Each thread is interconnected, and every action resonates throughout the entire structure. Time travelers attempting to reshape this web often find themselves caught in its threads, inadvertently strengthening the very patterns they sought to unravel. Whether viewed as a cautionary tale or a philosophical puzzle, the paradox remains one of the most compelling aspects of time travel theory. It invites us to consider the possibility that our attempts to rewrite history may simply reinforce its most immutable truths. The Bootstrap Paradox is a fascinating concept that challenges our understanding of time and causality. It occurs when an object or piece of information exists in a time loop, seemingly without an origin. This paradox raises questions about the nature of cause and effect, and it forces us to confront the logical inconsistencies that arise when time travel enters the equation. Imagine a person in possession of a book, containing detailed instructions on how to build a revolutionary device. The person travels back in time and gives this book to a younger version of themselves. This younger version uses the book to construct the device and later publishes the same instructions in a book. Over time, the book ends up in the hands of the older version of the same person, who takes it back in time to repeat the cycle. The question then arises, who wrote the book in the first place? It appears as though the book has no true origin. It simply exists because it was passed through the loop. This paradox forces us to grapple with the concept of causality. In everyday life, we assume that every effect has a cause. A tree grows because a seed was planted, a river flows because of gravity, and a person exists because of their parents. The Bootstrap Paradox flips this idea on its head by presenting an effect, a book or an object, that seemingly has no cause. It simply exists, looping through time without an identifiable starting point. To further explore this idea, consider the example of a musician who travels back in time and performs a song they know from their own era. A young aspiring artist hears the song, records it, and releases it to the world. Over time, this song becomes a classic, and the musician eventually learns it in their own timeline before traveling back to perform it. Where did the song come from? It exists only because it was trapped in the loop, with no clear origin. The Bootstrap Paradox raises questions about the nature of time itself. In our everyday experience, time flows in one direction, from the past to the future. We are born, we age, and we move forward through life. Time travel introduces the possibility of disrupting this linear flow, allowing events to loop back on themselves. This disruption challenges our intuitive understanding of how the universe operates. If something exists solely because it was brought into the past, how does this fit into the broader framework of reality? One potential explanation lies in the concept of a closed time-like curve, which is a theoretical construct in physics. A closed time-like curve is a path in space-time that loops back on itself, allowing objects or information to revisit earlier points in time. While this concept remains purely theoretical, it provides a framework for understanding how a bootstrap paradox might occur. If time can curve back on itself, then it becomes theoretically possible for objects or information to exist in a loop without a clear origin. However, even within this framework, the paradox presents challenges. It forces us to confront the problem of causality violation, where the traditional cause and effect relationship breaks down. Physicists and philosophers debate whether such violations are possible in our universe. Some argue that the laws of physics may prevent time loops from occurring, while others suggest that time loops could exist, but only under highly specific and unlikely conditions. Another way to approach the bootstrap paradox is through the lens of information theory. Consider a scenario where someone travels back in time and gives the plans for a groundbreaking invention to a younger version of themselves. The younger self studies the plans, builds the invention, and later writes the plans down to complete the loop. In this case, the information contained in the plans has no identifiable origin. It exists only because it was passed through the loop. This raises questions about the conservation of information and whether it is possible for information to exist without an initial source. The paradox also has implications for our understanding of free will. If someone is trapped in a time loop, are they truly free to make decisions, or are they constrained by the events of the loop? In the case of the musician performing the song or the inventor sharing their plans, it seems as though their actions are predetermined by the structure of the loop. They are compelled to perform the same actions repeatedly to ensure the loop remains intact. This challenges our intuitive belief in free will and raises questions about whether we are truly in control of our actions. One way to resolve the paradox is to assume that time travel is not possible in the way we imagine it. If the universe enforces a rule that prevents time loops, then the bootstrap paradox becomes a purely theoretical construct with no real-world implications. Alternatively, some theories suggest that time travel could create parallel timelines where any changes to the past result in a new, separate timeline rather than affecting the original one. In this case, the paradox could be avoided because the object or information would have an origin in one timeline, even if it appears to lack an origin in another. Another intriguing possibility is that the universe may allow time loops, but operates under a principle of self-consistency. This principle suggests that events in a time loop must be internally consistent and cannot create contradictions. In the example of the book or the song, the loop exists because the events fit together seamlessly, even if the origin of the information remains a mystery. While this explanation resolves some logical issues, it does not fully address the unsettling nature of the paradox. The Bootstrap Paradox has captured the imagination of writers, filmmakers, and philosophers for decades. It serves as the basis for countless science fiction stories, where characters grapple with the consequences of time travel and the mysteries of causality. These stories often use the paradox as a narrative device to explore deeper themes, such as the nature of identity, the limits of human knowledge, and the ethical implications of altering the past. Despite its theoretical nature, the Bootstrap Paradox holds valuable lessons for how we think about the universe. It challenges us to question our assumptions about time, causality, and the nature of reality. It pushes the boundaries of our imagination and invites us to consider possibilities that lie beyond our current understanding. While we may never encounter a real-life Bootstrap Paradox, the questions it raises are far from trivial. They remind us that our understanding of the universe is far from complete, and that the mysteries of time may hold the key to unlocking new insights about the nature of existence. As we continue to explore the possibilities of time travel and delve deeper into the physics of space-time, the Bootstrap Paradox remains a thought-provoking puzzle that inspires curiosity and wonder. A fixed time loop is a scenario where time cannot be altered, no matter how much someone tries to change events. In this type of loop, the person experiencing it is trapped in a cycle where everything happens in the same way during each iteration. Even when they attempt to make changes or influence outcomes, their actions inevitably lead to the same result. This creates a sense of inevitability, as if the timeline has a built-in mechanism that resists any form of alteration. Imagine someone discovering they are reliving the same day over and over. At first, they may try to act differently, thinking they can break free from the loop. For instance, they might choose to take a different route to work or avoid interactions with certain people. However, no matter what they do, the day ends in exactly the same way. If they accidentally spill coffee on their shirt during one loop, they might decide to skip drinking coffee the next time. Yet, somehow something else will happen to ensure the shirt still gets stained. It could be rain, a splash from a passing car, or an accidental spill at lunch. The outcome remains unchanged, as if the timeline is correcting itself to maintain consistency. This unchangeable nature of events can be frustrating and disorienting for someone caught in the loop. The person may try increasingly drastic measures, believing that if they disrupt the timeline enough, they can escape. They might decide to skip work entirely, thinking it will prevent a chain of events that leads to the loop's ending. However, something always pulls them back. Maybe an unexpected phone call forces them to address the very issue they were trying to avoid. The loop seems to have its own logic, ensuring that every action they take ultimately fits into the same preordained pattern. One of the most fascinating aspects of a fixed time loop is that the person inside it may not initially realize they are stuck. For example, if someone wakes up in the same morning repeatedly, it might take several cycles before they notice something strange is happening. The repetition of events could feel like déjà vu at first, a vague sense that they've done this all before. Over time, as the patterns become undeniable, they recognize the loop and begin searching for ways to break free. When someone tries to make sense of a fixed time loop, they might wonder about its cause. Theories could range from scientific explanations, like a disruption in the space-time continuum, to supernatural forces at play. However, in a fixed time loop, the cause often becomes secondary to the experience itself. The focus shifts to understanding the rules of the loop and whether escape is even possible. Unlike other types of time loops, where actions can lead to different outcomes, this type offers no such flexibility. Every attempt to change events circles back to the same conclusion, reinforcing the idea that time is immutable. To illustrate this further, consider a scenario where someone is reliving the day of an important meeting. Let's say they are trying to impress their boss to secure a promotion. During the first loop, they miss the meeting because of a flat tire on their way to work. In the next iteration, they prepare by checking the car tires beforehand, but an unexpected traffic jam delays them instead. On their third attempt, they decide to leave earlier to avoid traffic, only to find themselves locked out of the office because they forgot their key card. No matter what they do, something always prevents them from attending the meeting. The more they try to fix things, the more they realize that their efforts are futile. The outcome never changes. This sense of inevitability can raise profound philosophical questions. If events are fixed and cannot be altered, does free will exist within the loop? The person may feel like they are making choices, but if every decision ultimately leads to the same result, are those choices truly theirs to make? It might seem as if the loop itself is dictating their actions, reducing their role to that of a passive observer in their own life. This can lead to feelings of helplessness and despair as they grapple with the idea that they are powerless to influence their fate. However, not everyone responds to a fixed time loop with frustration or hopelessness. Some individuals may come to terms with the situation and find meaning within the repetition. For example, a person might use their time in the loop to refine a particular skill or learn more about the people around them. If they know the outcome is unchangeable, they might focus instead on perfecting their performance within the cycle. An artist stuck in a fixed time loop could paint the same landscape each day, striving to create the perfect masterpiece. A teacher might use the loop to help their students in new and innovative ways, knowing they have an endless supply of time to dedicate to the task. The fixed nature of the loop can also serve as a source of reflection. For someone caught in the cycle, the repetition might force them to confront aspects of their life they've been avoiding. With no way to escape the loop, they are left with nothing but time to examine their choices, relationships, and priorities. This could lead to personal growth, even in the absence of a resolution. While the loop remains unbreakable, the individual's perception of it may shift, allowing them to find peace within the unchanging flow of events. Interestingly, the concept of a fixed time loop has parallels in storytelling and mythology. Many ancient tales feature themes of repetition and unchangeable destiny. For example, the myth of Sisyphus describes a man condemned to push a boulder up a hill, only for it to roll back down every time he nears the top. This endless task mirrors the experience of being trapped in a fixed time loop, where no amount of effort leads to a different result. Similarly, modern stories like Groundhog Day explore the idea of reliving the same day repeatedly, although these narratives often include a way for the character to eventually escape. In reality, the idea of time being fixed is closely tied to certain interpretations of physics. The concept of determinism suggests that the past, present, and future are all interconnected, and events unfold according to a set of unchangeable rules. If this is true, then a fixed time loop would simply be a manifestation of time's inherent structure. The loop itself would not be an anomaly, but rather a natural consequence of the way the universe operates. Ultimately, a fixed time loop forces individuals to confront their relationship with time and the nature of their existence. It challenges the idea that we have control over our lives, presenting a reality where every outcome is preordained. While this can be a source of frustration, it can also be an opportunity for growth and self-discovery. Within the unchanging boundaries of the loop, a person can learn to appreciate the moments they might otherwise overlook, finding meaning in the repetition rather than resisting it. The fixed time loop remains a compelling concept because it taps into universal fears and desires. It asks questions about the nature of free will, the value of time, and our ability to shape our destiny. Whether viewed as a curse or a chance for transformation, the loop offers a unique lens through which to examine the human experience. By embracing its constraints, a person might discover that even in the absence of change, there is still room for understanding, acceptance, and perhaps even a measure of peace. The infinite regress paradox occurs when a time loop creates a chain of events that leads endlessly backward. Each iteration depends on a previous one, and the cycle has no clear starting point or resolution. Imagine a person traveling back in time to change an event. In doing so, they trigger a sequence that causes themselves, or another version of themselves, to repeat the act again and again. There's no escape because the act of going back in time creates the need to go back again. This paradox raises significant questions about causality, the nature of time, and whether an origin is even necessary in such a loop. To understand this, consider a scenario. A scientist discovers a way to travel back in time. Their goal is to warn their younger self about a mistake that led to disaster. When they do, their younger self avoids the mistake, but now has no reason to invent time travel in the first place. This contradiction creates a paradox. If the disaster never happened, the scientist would never have gone back in time to warn their younger self. If they didn't warn their younger self, the mistake would still occur. To resolve this, the timeline creates a loop where the scientist always goes back in time, warns their younger self, and the process repeats endlessly. Each iteration depends on the one before it, yet no iteration ever solves the underlying contradiction. The heart of the infinite regress paradox lies in its lack of an origin point. Unlike other time paradoxes, which often deal with specific events or outcomes, this one loops endlessly with no beginning. This absence of a starting point makes it fundamentally different from other scenarios. In a typical time travel story, there's an inciting event. The scientist invents a time machine, the traveler decides to change history, or a catastrophe prompts someone to intervene. In the infinite regress paradox, the inciting event itself depends on the loop. It's not just that the loop is endless, it's that there's no point where you can say, this is where it all started. This lack of a clear starting point creates logical and philosophical challenges. For example, can an event exist if it has no origin? If the scientist never invents the time machine because they prevented the disaster, then how did the time machine come into being? The loop sustains itself without external input, which defies conventional notions of cause and effect. In everyday life, events have causes. If you drop a glass, it breaks because gravity pulls it to the ground. In the infinite regress paradox, events have no clear cause. The loop exists because it exists, and that's all there is to it. Some theories suggest that this kind of loop might be stable in a self-contained timeline. In this view, time is not linear, but cyclical. The loop exists because it fits within the natural flow of time. However, this raises another question. If time is cyclical, why don't we observe more loops in our daily lives? If loops can exist without a beginning, why are they so rare? Perhaps they're not as rare as they seem. Maybe certain phenomena, like déjà vu, are subtle hints of loops we don't fully understand. Or perhaps time loops exist only under specific conditions, such as the manipulation of time through advanced technology or unique cosmic events. Another layer of complexity arises when we consider the role of memory. In many time loop scenarios, individuals retain memories from previous iterations. This allows them to learn, grow, and eventually escape the loop. In the infinite regress paradox, memory retention would make the loop even more puzzling. If the scientist remembers every iteration, they would eventually realize the loop's futility. They would know that no matter how many times they go back, the loop will reset. This awareness could lead to frustration, despair, or even madness. On the other hand, memory retention might offer a slim hope of breaking the cycle. If the scientist could find a way to disrupt the loop's self-sustaining nature, they might escape. But this raises yet another question. If the loop has no beginning, can it have an end? Without memory retention, the loop becomes even more confounding. Each iteration plays out as if it's the first, with no knowledge of the previous cycles. This creates a situation where the participants are trapped in an eternal now, unaware of the larger pattern. They repeat the same actions endlessly, never realizing they've done it all before. In this version of the paradox, the loop is not just endless, but also meaningless. Without awareness, the participants have no chance of escape, and the loop continues indefinitely. The infinite regress paradox also challenges our understanding of free will. If each iteration depends on the one before it, then do the participants have any real agency? Consider the scientist again. If they go back in time because of a disaster, and that disaster only occurs because they went back in time, then their actions are predetermined by the loop. They may feel like they're making choices, but those choices are dictated by the structure of the loop. This raises questions about whether free will can exist in a time loop. If every action is part of an endless cycle, then perhaps free will is an illusion. This paradox also has implications for the nature of time itself. In most theories of time, events occur in a linear sequence: past, present, future. The infinite regress paradox breaks this sequence. The loop exists outside of linear time, with no clear past or future. This suggests that time might be more flexible than we think. Instead of a straight line, time could be a network of interconnected loops and branches. If this is true, then the infinite regress paradox is not just a theoretical curiosity, but a glimpse into the deeper structure of reality. One way to explore the paradox further is through the lens of quantum mechanics. In quantum theory, particles can exist in multiple states at once, and events can influence one another across time and space. This has led some physicists to suggest that time loops might be possible at the quantum level. If so, the infinite regress paradox could be a natural consequence of how the universe operates. In a quantum time loop, each iteration would exist simultaneously with all the others, creating a complex web of cause and effect. This might resolve some of the paradox's contradictions, but it would also make the loop even harder to understand. Ultimately, the infinite regress paradox forces us to confront the limits of our knowledge. It challenges our assumptions about causality, time, and existence itself. It's a puzzle with no clear solution, a loop with no escape. Yet, it's also a fascinating thought experiment that pushes the boundaries of what we think is possible. By grappling with this paradox, we gain a deeper understanding of the mysteries of time and the complexities of the universe. Whether or not we ever resolve it, the infinite regress paradox will continue to inspire curiosity and debate for years to come. The grandfather paradox is one of the most famous thought experiments in time travel. It raises a question about causality. What happens if you go back in time and change something that would prevent your own existence? The classic scenario is that a person travels back in time and kills their grandfather before their parent is conceived. If this happens, the time traveler would never be born. But if the time traveler was never born, they couldn't have gone back in time to kill their grandfather. This creates a logical contradiction, often referred to as a paradox, and forces us to examine the nature of cause and effect. Let's break this down with a simple scenario. Imagine you invent a time machine. You're curious about the past and decide to visit the era when your grandfather was a young man. For reasons unknown, perhaps anger or even an accident, you end up killing him before he meets your grandmother. Without your grandfather and grandmother meeting, your parent would not exist. And if your parent never existed, you would never exist. So how could you have traveled back in time in the first place? This loop of cause and effect, where the act of going back in time erases the conditions that made time travel possible, is the essence of the paradox. The issue with the grandfather paradox is that it challenges our basic understanding of how time and causality work. In the real world, we assume that causes lead to effects in a linear, logical sequence. If you knock over a glass of water, the water spills. The cause, knocking the glass, comes before the effect, the spill. Time travel, particularly when it involves changing the past, disrupts this flow. By interfering with the past, you might eliminate the very cause that allowed you to travel back in time, creating a logical inconsistency. There are several ways theorists try to resolve the grandfather paradox, each with its own implications for how time and reality might function. One idea is that time is immutable. In this view, the past cannot be changed, no matter what you do. If you traveled back in time and attempted to kill your grandfather, something would always intervene to prevent it. The gun might jam, or you might miss your target, or someone else might stop you. No matter how hard you try, you could never succeed in altering events that have already occurred. This idea aligns with the fixed timeline theory, which suggests that all events are locked into place. In such a timeline, time travel might be possible, but it would be limited to observing or participating in events without changing them. Another possible resolution is the idea of parallel timelines or alternate realities. According to this theory, when you travel back in time and make a change, such as killing your grandfather, you create a new timeline that branches off from the original. In this new timeline, your grandfather is dead and you were never born, but the original timeline where your grandfather lived and you existed remains intact. This approach avoids the logical contradiction because the act of altering the past doesn't erase the original sequence of events. It simply creates a new, parallel reality. In this framework, you could still exist in your original timeline, even though you've created a new one where you do not. A third resolution is the idea of self-consistency within time loops. This theory suggests that if you travel back in time, the actions you take are already part of history. In this scenario, any attempt to change the past would actually contribute to the very events you're trying to alter. For instance, if you traveled back and inadvertently caused your grandfather's death, it might turn out that your grandfather wasn't your biological ancestor after all, and your family history was always different than you believed. This approach maintains a consistent timeline and avoids paradoxes by ensuring that all events, including those caused by time travelers, fit seamlessly into the flow of history. The grandfather paradox also highlights deeper philosophical questions about free will and determinism. If time travel to the past is possible and the timeline is fixed, does that mean we lack free will? If you go back in time and find yourself unable to kill your grandfather, does that suggest that your actions are predetermined? On the other hand, if you have the freedom to change the past and create a new timeline, does that mean every action you take creates a branching reality? These questions challenge our understanding of choice, agency, and the nature of time itself. The paradox becomes even more intriguing when we consider the psychological impact of being stuck in such a situation. Imagine traveling back in time and trying repeatedly to change the past, only to find that your actions are either futile or result in unintended consequences. Each attempt might teach you more about the limits of your power and the complexity of the timeline, but it could also lead to frustration, despair, or even a sense of resignation. The grandfather paradox isn't just a problem of logic. It's also a deeply human story about our desire to control our destiny and the limits of that control. In popular culture, the grandfather paradox is often explored in movies, books, and television shows, sometimes with creative twists. For example, in Back to the Future, Marty McFly inadvertently disrupts his parents' meeting, putting his own existence at risk. The story focuses on his efforts to repair the timeline, emphasizing the fragile connections between past, present, and future. In contrast, other stories like Looper embrace the idea of paradoxes and alternate timelines, leaving questions unresolved to highlight the mysterious nature of time. Scientific perspectives on time travel also grapple with the grandfather paradox. Some physicists argue that the paradox suggests time travel to the past is impossible because it would violate the laws of causality. Others propose that advanced physics, such as the concept of wormholes or closed time-like curves, might allow for time travel while preventing paradoxes through mechanisms we don't yet understand. Quantum mechanics, with its inherent uncertainty and superposition of states, offers another possible framework for resolving the paradox, though these ideas remain speculative. Ultimately, the grandfather paradox forces us to confront the limits of our understanding of time and causality. It's a reminder that our intuitive grasp of how the world works might not apply to the strange hypothetical realm of time travel. Whether time is fixed, branching, or self-consistent, the paradox reveals the deep interconnections between events and the challenges of untangling them. In the end, the grandfather paradox isn't just a puzzle for physicists or philosophers. It's also a metaphor for our relationship with the past. While we may not have the ability to travel back in time, we all wrestle with the consequences of past actions and decisions. The paradox serves as a powerful reminder that our choices, for better or worse, shape the future in ways we may not fully understand. And in that sense, perhaps the grandfather paradox is less about time travel and more about the timeless human desire to understand our place in the universe. Quantum time loops present a fascinating way to think about the relationship between time, reality, and human perception. Rooted in the principles of quantum mechanics, this theory proposes that time loops might emerge because of quantum superposition, where multiple states or events exist simultaneously until observed or acted upon. Imagine a scenario where time isn't linear or fixed, but a fluid system where different possibilities overlap, each influencing the other in subtle, intricate ways. This idea challenges how we traditionally view cause and effect and suggests that time loops could be an inherent feature of the universe. To understand quantum time loops, it helps to first think about the concept of quantum superposition. In quantum mechanics, particles such as electrons or photons can exist in multiple states at once. A famous example of this is Schrödinger's cat, where a hypothetical cat in a box is both alive and dead until someone opens the box and observes its state. This duality isn't just theoretical, it's been demonstrated experimentally in controlled environments. Superposition shows us that reality doesn't commit to a single outcome until there's some form of interaction or measurement. Now extend this principle to time. If quantum particles can exist in multiple states simultaneously, it raises the possibility that entire events, each made up of countless quantum interactions, could also coexist in overlapping timelines. In this view, a time loop might not be a glitch or anomaly, but a natural consequence of quantum systems. Events could repeat, not because time itself is broken, but because the system is cycling through its potential states. Picture a person experiencing a quantum time loop. Let's say they walk into a room and see a cup falling off a table. They try to catch it, but they miss, and the cup breaks. A moment later, they find themselves back at the door of the room, about to witness the cup fall again. Each time the loop resets, they have the chance to act differently. Perhaps on the fifth iteration, they position themselves perfectly and manage to catch the cup before it breaks. In a classical view of time, this repetition would seem nonsensical. Time shouldn't rewind like that. But in a quantum time loop, the repeated moments are simply the system exploring its overlapping states until one specific outcome stabilizes the loop. What's intriguing about this idea is that it doesn't require an external force or technology to create the loop. Unlike science fiction, where time machines or wormholes trigger time loops, quantum time loops could arise naturally in the right conditions. These conditions might involve high-energy environments, extreme gravitational forces, or specific interactions at the quantum level that cause a local area of space-time to freeze in a repeating cycle. The loop could even be self-sustaining, recycling itself endlessly until the probabilities align in a way that breaks the cycle. Consider the role of the observer in this scenario. In quantum mechanics, observation has a profound effect on outcomes. When you measure a particle in superposition, you force it to commit to one state or another. In a quantum time loop, the observer might play a similar role, unwittingly influencing how the loop unfolds. For instance, if the person in the loop becomes aware of their predicament and starts acting differently, they could push the loop toward an outcome that resolves it. On the other hand, if they remain passive and repeat the same actions each time, the loop might continue indefinitely, cycling through the same states without ever breaking free. Memory retention adds another layer to this idea. In many fictional depictions of time loops, the protagonist remembers previous iterations while everyone else resets. This might not just be a narrative device. It could reflect a real consequence of quantum systems. If the observer's mind, or consciousness, is linked to the loop's quantum state, they might carry information from one iteration to the next. This would give them an edge in navigating the loop and eventually escaping it. In the example of the falling cup, the person might gradually learn the perfect timing and positioning needed to catch it, using their accumulated memories to guide their actions. But what happens if the loop isn't resolved? One possibility is that it continues indefinitely, creating a kind of stasis. From the perspective of the person trapped inside, it would feel like an endless repetition. From an outside perspective, however, the loop might not even exist in a conventional sense. Because of quantum superposition, the loop could be a closed system, isolated from the rest of time and space. To an external observer, the events inside the loop might appear frozen or undefined, much like a particle in superposition before it's measured. Quantum time loops also raise interesting questions about free will. If every iteration of the loop explores different possibilities, does the person trapped in the loop truly have control over their actions? Or are they simply playing out the system's probabilities, with each choice predetermined by quantum mechanics? The answer might lie somewhere in between. Quantum systems are inherently probabilistic, meaning they're governed by likelihoods rather than certainties. This suggests that while the person's actions might be influenced by the loop's parameters, there's still room for spontaneity and unpredictability. Another fascinating implication of quantum time loops is the potential for cross-communication between iterations. If quantum states can overlap and interact, it's conceivable that information from one loop iteration could bleed into another. This might explain phenomena like déjà vu, where someone feels like they've experienced a moment before. In a quantum time loop, déjà vu could be a literal memory fragment from a previous iteration, subtly influencing the current one. It's even possible that these fragments could accumulate over multiple loops, allowing the person to piece together a larger picture of their situation. On a larger scale, quantum time loops challenge our understanding of the universe as a whole. If loops can exist at the quantum level, could they also occur on a cosmic scale? Some physicists speculate that the universe itself might be in a kind of time loop, cycling through phases of expansion and contraction. In this model, the Big Bang wouldn't be the beginning of time, but just the latest reset in an eternal sequence of loops. Each iteration could be slightly different, with small quantum variations leading to new arrangements of matter, energy, and even physical laws. Quantum time loops may sound far-fetched, but they're grounded in real scientific principles. The interplay between superposition, observation, and probability creates a framework where time loops aren't just possible. They're a natural extension of quantum mechanics. They invite us to rethink our assumptions about time, causality, and reality itself. While we may not yet have direct evidence of quantum time loops, the theory opens up a realm of possibilities that could reshape how we understand the universe. In exploring these possibilities, it's important to stay grounded. Theoretical physics often deals with ideas that are mathematically elegant but difficult to test experimentally. Quantum time loops may remain a thought experiment for now, but they're a reminder of how much we have yet to learn about the nature of time. As we continue to study quantum mechanics and its implications, we may one day discover that time loops aren't just a science fiction trope. They're a fundamental part of how reality works. The butterfly effect in time loops highlights how small changes in one iteration can cause massive, unintended consequences in future iterations. This concept builds on the idea that small actions or decisions, no matter how trivial they might seem, can ripple through time and create unpredictable outcomes. When applied to time loops, the stakes are magnified because each iteration provides a new chance to alter the sequence of events, and these changes compound over repeated cycles. Imagine a person trapped in a time loop. On the first day, they wake up, follow their usual routine, and everything unfolds predictably. But during the second loop, they make one small change. They decide to smile at someone they wouldn't normally acknowledge. This simple gesture could lead to a chain of events they never anticipated. Perhaps the person they smiled at feels uplifted, decides to help someone else later in the day, and that act of kindness spirals into a series of positive changes for multiple people. However, as the loop resets again, the person trapped in the loop might choose a different small change, like staying inside instead of venturing out. This could have an equally significant but entirely different impact. In time loops, every tiny decision, even the seemingly irrelevant ones, can shift the future in ways that the person experiencing the loop cannot fully predict. This dynamic can become chaotic because, in a time loop, the person often retains their memories of previous iterations. They can reflect on their past decisions and attempt to tweak them in future loops to achieve a specific outcome. For instance, they might have experienced an accident in one iteration of the loop, and in the next, attempt to avoid it by leaving earlier or taking a different route. While they may succeed in sidestepping the accident, their altered behavior may inadvertently set off an entirely new series of events, some of which could be even worse than the original outcome. Let's consider a scenario to illustrate how the butterfly effect operates within time loops. A man named Eric finds himself stuck in a loop where the same 24 hours repeat endlessly. During the first iteration, Eric notices a dog crossing the street at a busy intersection. A driver slams on the brakes, narrowly avoiding the dog. This minor event doesn't seem significant at first. In the second iteration, Eric decides to intervene by grabbing the dog before it runs into the street. He feels good about this small act of heroism, but in doing so, he accidentally delays the driver by a few seconds. Because of this delay, the driver now reaches a different intersection at the exact moment another car runs a red light, causing a collision that wasn't part of the original timeline. Eric realizes that his seemingly kind act created a far worse outcome. Determined to fix this unintended consequence, Eric tries a new approach in the third loop. This time, instead of grabbing the dog, he decides to block traffic by standing in the middle of the road, ensuring that the dog never enters the intersection. This strategy works. He prevents both the dog incident and the car collision. However, his actions cause a traffic jam, and one of the delayed drivers misses a critical appointment. The driver, furious about the delay, acts recklessly later in the day, leading to an unrelated but equally disastrous event. The butterfly effect in time loops ensures that every adjustment, no matter how well-meaning, has the potential to trigger new and unforeseen consequences. The unpredictability of these ripple effects creates a challenge for anyone stuck in a time loop. They might begin with good intentions, striving to correct perceived mistakes or achieve a desired outcome, but the complexity of cause and effect often thwarts their efforts. Each new iteration of the loop adds layers of complexity, as the consequences of prior loops begin to intersect and overlap. The person might start to feel like they're playing an unwinnable game, where every move has unintended consequences that spiral further out of their control. Another important aspect of the butterfly effect in time loops is how it reflects human nature. People naturally want to improve their circumstances, and the repetitive nature of a time loop provides countless opportunities to experiment with different choices. But the butterfly effect serves as a reminder that life is interconnected in ways that are impossible to fully predict or control. The smallest deviations in behavior, such as taking a different route, speaking to someone new, or even staying silent, can have a cascading impact. This interconnectedness often leads to moral dilemmas. For example, if someone in a loop discovers that saving one person's life inadvertently causes another person's death in a later iteration, they must grapple with whether their interference is helping or harming the larger picture. One of the most famous cultural depictions of the butterfly effect in a time loop comes from the film Groundhog Day. In the movie, the protagonist, Phil, is trapped in a repeating day and tries various approaches to escape the loop. Early on, he makes selfish choices, using the loop to indulge his desires without regard for others. As he begins to understand the consequences of his actions, he shifts toward altruism, helping others and trying to improve their lives. However, even with good intentions, he discovers that his actions can have unintended side effects, and it takes countless iterations before he finds a balance that allows him to escape the loop. While the film takes a comedic approach, it underscores the unpredictable nature of the butterfly effect within time loops and the difficulty of controlling outcomes. In a more philosophical sense, the butterfly effect in time loops challenges our understanding of free will and agency. If every small decision can lead to vast and unpredictable consequences, how much control do we truly have over the outcomes of our actions? This question becomes even more complex when applied to someone experiencing a time loop, as they are uniquely positioned to see the direct results of their choices across multiple iterations. They are both empowered and burdened by this knowledge, as their awareness of the loop gives them the ability to experiment, but also forces them to confront the far-reaching impact of their actions. Over time, someone trapped in a time loop may become hyper-aware of the butterfly effect and attempt to limit their actions to avoid unintended consequences. This approach, however, is often unsustainable. Inaction can have just as many ripples as action. For example, if Eric decides to do nothing during a loop and simply observes events as they unfold, his mere presence might still alter the course of events in subtle ways. Perhaps someone notices him standing idly and chooses to interact with him, setting off a new chain of events. The butterfly effect ensures that even passivity is not without consequences. Ultimately, the butterfly effect in time loops demonstrates the impossibility of fully understanding or controlling the interconnected web of cause and effect. It emphasizes the fragility of timelines and the unintended outcomes that can arise from even the smallest changes. For someone caught in a time loop, this phenomenon creates a paradoxical situation. They have the power to shape events, but lack the foresight to predict where those changes will lead. The butterfly effect ensures that each iteration of the loop is a learning experience, forcing the individual to confront the limits of their knowledge and control. In the end, escaping the loop might require not just solving the puzzle of the timeline, but also coming to terms with the inherent unpredictability of life itself. A time loop, by its nature, raises questions about how the universe operates. At the heart of this discussion lies entropy, the measure of disorder or randomness in a system. In physics, entropy always increases in a closed system, a principle tied to the second law of thermodynamics. This principle suggests that time moves in one direction, from past to future, as systems become more disordered over time. A time loop, however, seems to defy this fundamental law. If events keep resetting and replaying, the natural progression of entropy appears to reverse or halt entirely, creating a paradox. This contradiction between time loops and entropy is what we call the entropy reset paradox. Imagine you're caught in a time loop where the same day repeats endlessly. Each time the loop resets, you find yourself back at the exact same point, perhaps waking up in your bed as if nothing had happened. The events of the day unfold again, just as they did the first time, and any changes or actions you made during the previous iteration are erased. For you, this might feel like being trapped in a never-ending cycle. But from the universe's perspective, something even stranger is happening. The state of the world is somehow returning to its earlier configuration. The cup you broke the first time around is unbroken. The meals you ate are uneaten. Even the smallest particles in the universe are somehow restored to their original positions. This perfect reset violates what we know about entropy. To understand why this is strange, consider how entropy works in everyday life. If you pour cream into coffee, the two liquids mix and form a homogeneous blend. This process is irreversible because the entropy of the system increases as the cream and coffee combine. You cannot unmix them without expending significant energy and introducing additional changes to the system. The same principle applies on a larger scale. The universe as a whole tends toward greater disorder. Stars burn their fuel, leaving behind remnants. Ice melts into water. Systems naturally move toward states of higher entropy. Time loops, however, seem to undo this process completely. When the loop resets, it isn't just reversing the mixing of cream and coffee, it's unburning the fuel, unmoving the particles, and unmelting the ice. This reset flies in the face of everything we understand about how systems behave. One explanation often invoked in science fiction is that time loops are an exception to the rules of thermodynamics because they exist outside normal time. In this view, a loop operates like a self-contained bubble where entropy can reset without affecting the broader universe. This idea provides a convenient way to sidestep the paradox, but it raises new questions. If the loop is a closed system, what mechanism forces the reset? Where does the energy come from to rewind everything to its original state? Energy cannot simply appear out of nowhere. In our universe, conservation laws require that energy remain constant. The time loop, by resetting the state of the system, would violate this principle unless it somehow borrows energy from an external source. Let's ground this paradox in an example to make it easier to visualize. Suppose there's a scientist named Elena working in a laboratory. She's trying to develop a machine to manipulate time and accidentally triggers a time loop. The loop resets every 24 hours, bringing her back to the moment she activated the machine. On the first day, Elena breaks a glass beaker. On the second day, the glass is whole again, as if it had never been broken. From her perspective, this seems like magic, but in reality, it represents an enormous violation of physical laws. For the beaker to reassemble itself, Every shard would have to return to its exact position and velocity from the previous day. The energy required to reverse the breakage would need to come from somewhere, and yet no such source is apparent. Over multiple iterations of the loop, Elena starts to notice more subtle effects. For example, the air molecules in the room return to their original positions each day. If she heats a cup of tea, the loop resets the tea back to its original temperature. These observations lead her to conclude that the time loop isn't just affecting her memory or her immediate surroundings, it's affecting the entire physical state of the universe. The loop is undoing entropy on a universal scale. This realization leads to a troubling thought. If the time loop truly resets everything, it's not just physical objects that are affected. Information, too, would need to be erased. This includes everything from the state of her computer files to her own biological processes. For instance, any neural changes in Elena's brain from learning or forming memories would be undone. Yet, paradoxically, Elena retains her memories of previous iterations. If the loop resets entropy completely, how is this possible? Her memories should be erased along with everything else. This inconsistency deepens the paradox, as it suggests that some information is immune to the reset while other information is not. One possible explanation for this is that the time loop operates selectively, targeting certain aspects of the system while leaving others untouched. Perhaps Elena's memories persist because they exist on a different plane of reality that the loop doesn't affect. Alternatively, the loop could be resetting the universe only up to a certain level of complexity. It might reset physical systems like the beaker and the air molecules, but leave higher-level systems, such as consciousness, intact. However, both of these explanations introduce further complications. Why would the loop behave selectively? What determines which systems are reset and which are not? Another way to approach the entropy reset paradox is to consider the possibility that time itself is cyclical rather than linear. In a cyclical model, the universe undergoes endless cycles of expansion and contraction, or creation and destruction. Time loops could be a localized version of this phenomenon, where a specific segment of time repeats, while the larger universe continues its natural progression. In this model, the loop doesn't actually reverse entropy. Instead, it creates the illusion of a reset by rewinding only certain aspects of the system. While this idea sidesteps some of the paradoxes, it doesn't fully explain how or why the reset occurs. At its core, the entropy reset paradox challenges our understanding of time and causality. It suggests that if time loops are possible, the fundamental laws of physics may not be as immutable as we believe. Alternatively, it could mean that time loops exist within a framework that we don't yet comprehend, one where entropy operates differently. These ideas are speculative, but they highlight the limitations of our current knowledge. Elena, trapped in her loop, would likely try to find a way out by experimenting with the machine that caused it. In doing so, she might discover clues about how the loop functions and whether it can be escaped. If she were to succeed in breaking the loop, it might reveal whether entropy truly resets, or if the loop was an illusion all along. On the other hand, if the loop continues indefinitely, it raises another unsettling question. Does time itself have a natural endpoint? And if so, is a time loop the closest thing we'll ever experience to eternity? The entropy reset paradox forces us to confront the idea that our understanding of the universe is incomplete. While it may remain a thought experiment for now, it underscores the strange and often counterintuitive nature of time. Whether time loops are real or fictional, the paradoxes they create push the boundaries of how we think about reality. The observer paradox in time loops is a concept that explores how the awareness of an individual trapped in a time loop can fundamentally alter the loop itself. At its core, the paradox hinges on the idea that the mere act of knowing they are in a loop changes the trajectory of events. This feedback mechanism often creates increasing complexity as the observer attempts to make sense of their predicament or influence the loop's outcome. Unlike loops where events repeat endlessly and predictably, the observer's conscious decisions and understanding shape the very nature of the repetition. This interplay of awareness and causality leads to unique and often unpredictable consequences. Imagine an individual, let's call him Alex, trapped in a day-long time loop. Every morning, Alex wakes up at the same time and experiences the exact same sequence of events unless he consciously acts differently. The first time the loop resets, Alex might not even realize what is happening. He could attribute the repetition to déjà vu or coincidence. But as the loop persists, his awareness grows. He begins to anticipate events before they happen. For instance, he knows the barista will spill coffee on the counter at precisely 8:15 a.m., or that a stranger will trip over their shoelace at 2:30 p.m. This awareness gives Alex a sense of control over his environment. However, it also places him in a unique position of responsibility. By choosing to interfere with these predictable events, he changes the course of the loop. At first, Alex's choices might seem small. He stops the barista from spilling the coffee or warns the stranger about their shoelace. Yet, these minor changes ripple outward, creating unintended consequences. Maybe stopping the barista delays another customer, who then misses a job interview. Perhaps warning the stranger sets off a chain reaction that results in Alex being hit by a car later in the day. Each change creates a new version of the loop, and Alex, as the observer, becomes the central force shaping these variations. The paradox becomes apparent as Alex's knowledge and actions feed into the loop. The more he learns about the loop, the more he tries to control it, but his efforts to improve or escape often complicate the situation further. For example, Alex might decide to use his foreknowledge to prevent a major accident he witnesses during one iteration of the loop. He plans carefully, timing his actions to intervene at the right moment. But his intervention, though well-meaning, could cause a different disaster. Perhaps the accident he prevents was necessary to stop an even larger catastrophe later in the day. By altering one event, Alex inadvertently creates a chain reaction that worsens the outcome. This paradox highlights a key tension. The observer's awareness gives them power over the loop, but it also traps them in a cycle of unintended consequences. Each attempt to fix or escape the loop creates new problems that must be addressed in subsequent iterations. Over time, Alex might become overwhelmed by the sheer number of variables he must account for. His growing understanding of the loop doesn't simplify his task, it complicates it. The more he learns, the more he realizes how little control he actually has. This growing complexity can lead to frustration, despair, or even a sense of futility. To illustrate this further, let's imagine a specific scenario. In one iteration of the loop, Alex discovers that a fire will break out in an apartment building at 5 p.m., trapping several residents inside. Determined to prevent the tragedy, he spends the day preparing. He alerts the fire department, warns the residents, and even positions himself at the scene to help evacuate people. When the fire starts, his efforts save lives, and Alex feels a sense of accomplishment. However, as the day progresses, he realizes that his actions have led to an unexpected outcome. One of the residents he saved later causes a car accident that injures multiple people. In trying to prevent one tragedy, Alex has inadvertently caused another. The next time the loop resets, Alex tries a different approach. This time, he focuses on preventing the fire from starting in the first place. He tracks down the source of the fire and discovers it was caused by a faulty electrical outlet. He repairs the outlet early in the day, confident that he has solved the problem. But when the fire doesn't occur, the absence of the emergency alters the behavior of the building's residents in unforeseen ways. For instance, a neighbor who would have been delayed by the fire now leaves their apartment earlier, setting off a chain of events that leads to a robbery at a nearby store. These scenarios demonstrate how the observer paradox in time loops creates a self-perpetuating cycle of complexity. Each new piece of information Alex gains leads to new decisions, which in turn create new consequences. The paradox lies in the fact that Alex's awareness, which should theoretically give him an advantage, instead becomes a source of chaos. The more he tries to exert control, the less predictable the loop becomes. Over time, Alex might begin to question the purpose of the loop. Is he meant to learn something specific? Is there a way to escape? Or is the loop an endless cycle with no resolution? These questions add a psychological dimension to the paradox. The constant repetition and the weight of his decisions can take a toll on Alex's mental state. He might become paralyzed by the fear of making things worse or start to doubt whether his actions have any real impact. Alternatively, he could develop a sense of apathy, deciding that nothing he does matters since the loop will always reset. In some interpretations of the observer paradox, the loop itself responds to the observer's awareness. For instance, the loop might become more difficult to navigate as Alex learns more about it. Events could become less predictable, or new variables might be introduced to challenge his understanding. This dynamic creates a feedback loop where Alex's increasing knowledge and the loop's evolving complexity feed into each other, making it harder for him to find a way out. One way to resolve the paradox might be for Alex to shift his perspective. Instead of trying to control the loop or prevent specific outcomes, he could focus on understanding the underlying patterns and principles governing the loop. This approach requires letting go of the need for control and accepting that some outcomes are beyond his influence. By observing the loop without interference, Alex might gain insights that allow him to escape or transcend the cycle. The observer paradox in time loops raises profound questions about free will, causality, and the nature of time itself. It challenges the assumption that knowledge and awareness are inherently empowering. Instead, it shows how they can become sources of complexity and uncertainty. For someone trapped in a time loop, the paradox becomes a defining feature of their experience, shaping their actions, decisions, and ultimately their understanding of reality. A time loop where a character retains their memory through every iteration is a fascinating concept. Imagine someone caught in a repeating day or event. Unlike others who live each loop without awareness of the repetition, this person remembers everything from each cycle. This memory retention creates a unique dynamic where the character can refine their actions, learn from mistakes, and potentially find a way to escape or improve their situation. The idea of memory retention in a time loop is often used to explore themes of growth, regret, and self-discovery. In the first few loops, the character might feel disoriented. They wake up to the same day, the same conversations, the same events unfolding with no changes unless they act. Initially, they may dismiss it as a vivid sense of déjà vu or a strange dream. However, as the loop continues, they realize the phenomenon is real. The awareness of being trapped in time becomes undeniable. This realization can lead to panic. Imagine waking up and realizing that no matter what you do, the day resets. You could try everything, leave town, call for help, or even do nothing, and still, the same starting point awaits you. The mental toll of this revelation could be overwhelming. Many people would struggle to maintain their sanity in such a scenario. It might take dozens or hundreds of loops before the character moves beyond despair and begins to adapt. Once they accept their situation, the character starts experimenting. Memory retention becomes their most powerful tool. With each loop, they gain knowledge. They memorize conversations, learn about people's lives, and uncover details they would never have known otherwise. For example, they could discover a stranger's favorite coffee order by observing them repeatedly, or master a skill like playing the piano because they have unlimited time to practice. The repeating timeline becomes a sandbox for exploration and growth. Take a scenario where the character is caught in a single day. They start the day knowing what events will happen and how people will react. This foresight gives them the chance to alter outcomes. If someone drops a coffee cup at 8:15 a.m., they could prevent it by moving the cup before it falls. If they know an argument will erupt at noon, they could intervene early and stop it. Over time, their ability to predict and influence events becomes almost godlike. They could save lives, orchestrate perfect outcomes, or manipulate situations for their benefit. This power, however, comes with a moral weight. The more the character learns about the people around them, the more they must grapple with their actions. If they learn a secret about someone, such as a hidden affair or a long-buried trauma, what do they do with that knowledge? Should they confront the person, even if the loop erases the confrontation by the next day? Does having this knowledge make them responsible for using it wisely, even if no one else remembers? These questions add layers of complexity to their experience. Memory retention also allows the character to grow on a personal level. At the start of the loop, they might be selfish or apathetic, using the time to indulge in reckless or hedonistic behavior. For instance, they could rob a bank, knowing the consequences won't carry over to the next loop. They might treat people poorly or ignore their problems, assuming none of it matters in the long run. But as the loops continue, this mindset often changes. The character starts to see the world differently. When you spend enough time observing people, their pain, and their struggles, it becomes harder to stay detached. The character might realize that, even if the loop resets, their actions within it matter. They could begin to use their knowledge to help others, even if the impact only lasts for a single iteration. For example, they might spend an entire loop comforting someone who is grieving or helping a friend avoid a mistake. These small acts of kindness, while impermanent, could give the character a sense of purpose. The possibility of escape becomes a driving force. Memory retention means the character can try different strategies to break free. They might search for patterns or clues that hint at the cause of the loop. Maybe the answer lies in a specific place they've never visited, or perhaps they need to resolve an unresolved emotional conflict. Each loop offers an opportunity to experiment. One day, they could try leaving the city. Another, they might spend the entire time talking to a specific person. The repetition becomes both frustrating and a resource for problem solving. Failure is an inevitable part of this process. The character might believe they've found the key to breaking the loop, only to discover it doesn't work. For example, they could spend hundreds of loops trying to confess their love to someone, thinking it's the emotional resolution they need. When it fails, the disappointment could feel crushing. These setbacks force the character to reevaluate their assumptions and continue searching for answers. In some stories, the loop ends when the character achieves personal growth. For instance, they might need to confront a deep-seated fear or make peace with a past mistake. The loop becomes a metaphor for their journey of self-improvement. Every iteration pushes them closer to understanding themselves and what they need to change. When they finally break free, it feels earned, a reward for their perseverance and growth. On the other hand, some loops end without explanation. The character wakes up one day, and time moves forward as if nothing happened. This ambiguity can be both satisfying and unsettling. It raises questions about the nature of the loop and whether it was ever truly escapable. Did they change something crucial, or did the loop simply end on its own? The emotional toll of memory retention is worth considering. While it gives the character a unique advantage, it also isolates them. They live through events no one else remembers. Relationships become one-sided as the people around them forget everything with each reset. Imagine forming a deep bond with someone, only to have them act like a stranger the next day. Over time, this isolation could weigh heavily on the character. They might long for a normal life, even as they appreciate the power of their unique position. Memory retention loops also explore the idea of responsibility. If you know something bad will happen, such as a car accident or a robbery, do you have an obligation to stop it, even if no one else will remember? The character could struggle with the burden of being the only one who knows what's coming. Acting on this knowledge might make them feel like a hero, but failing to act could lead to guilt and regret. The loop forces them to confront their values and decide what kind of person they want to be. Ultimately, a memory retention time loop is a rich narrative device. It blends the thrill of repetition with deep emotional and philosophical questions. The character's journey becomes a reflection of human resilience, the search for meaning, and the importance of connection. Whether they escape the loop or remain trapped, their experience leaves a lasting impression on both the character and the audience. A person trapped in a moral dilemma loop experiences the same ethical choice over and over again. The decision they face is always the same at its core, but each iteration becomes increasingly complex. With every repetition, the stakes rise, and the consequences of their choice grow more severe. This scenario forces the person to confront their values, priorities, and understanding of right and wrong in ways they may never have expected. Imagine someone named Alex who wakes up every morning with the same problem. They are in a small town where a runaway cart is speeding toward 5 people tied to a track. A lever nearby could divert the cart to another track where only one person is tied. Alex is the only person in a position to act, and the situation resets each time they make a choice. Every day begins the same way. The runaway cart is rolling down the tracks, the lever is there, and the lives of innocent people hang in the balance. On the first day, the decision seems simple. Pull the lever, save 5 lives, sacrifice 1. It feels like the logical choice, and Alex acts without hesitation. The day resets, but this time, Alex starts to notice small details about the people involved. The single person on the sidetrack is no longer a faceless figure. It's someone they've interacted with briefly, maybe the clerk at the local shop who smiled kindly at them the previous day. The group of 5, on the other hand, remains unknown. Pulling the lever now feels less straightforward. As the loop continues, Alex begins learning more about all the people involved. Over time, they come to know the 5 people on the main track. They are not perfect individuals. One has a history of theft, another has lied about their past, and a third has harmed others in minor but troubling ways. Meanwhile, the single person on the sidetrack reveals themselves to be someone of deep character, a teacher who has dedicated their life to helping children. Suddenly, the choice to sacrifice 1 to save 5 isn't as easy as it first appeared. The loop doesn't let Alex escape the dilemma. Each time they make a choice, the loop resets. This creates a crushing sense of futility. No matter what they do, the cart will still roll the next day, and they will still have to decide again. But each iteration adds layers of complexity. One day, Alex learns that the group of 5 includes a young child. Another day, they discover that the single person is a parent with dependents. The emotional weight of these details begins to wear on them, and their confidence in their original decision wavers. By the 100th iteration, Alex is no longer sure what the right choice is. They have tried every possible variation. They have chosen to pull the lever and save the 5 at the expense of the 1, only to wake up the next day filled with regret for the life they ended. They have chosen to do nothing, letting the cart strike the 5, only to be haunted by their inaction. They have tried reasoning with the people involved, shouting warnings, or even physically attempting to stop the cart, but nothing ever works. The loop seems to exist only to force them into this impossible decision. The moral weight of the loop begins to take a toll on Alex's psyche. Each new iteration reveals more information about the people involved, and every piece of information complicates the decision further. At one point, Alex learns that one of the 5 is terminally ill and has only a few months to live, while the single person on the sidetrack has just discovered a cure for a rare disease. The stakes feel unbearable, and yet the loop doesn't allow for escape. The choice must be made, and Alex must live with the consequences, if only for a single day. The loop raises fundamental questions about morality. Is it better to save the greater number of people, even if the individuals are less deserving? Does one life outweigh many if that single life is particularly virtuous or significant? And what does it mean to deserve survival in the first place? Alex finds themselves grappling with these questions over and over again, with no clear answers. The loop offers no guidance, no judgment, and no resolution. At some point, Alex begins to experiment with their decisions. They stop trying to optimize the outcome and start making choices based on instinct or whim. One day, they pull the lever simply because they are tired of watching the cart hit the 5. Another day, they refuse to pull it out of defiance, refusing to play the loop's cruel game. These choices feel hollow, but they offer a brief respite from the crushing weight of overthinking. Eventually, Alex starts to consider the broader implications of the loop. What if the purpose isn't to make the right choice, but to confront the impossibility of perfect morality? The loop might exist to show that no decision is ever truly free from compromise or regret. Every choice involves loss, and every act of saving comes at a cost. Perhaps the loop is a reflection of real life, where moral dilemmas are rarely clear-cut, and where every action has consequences that ripple far beyond our understanding. This realization doesn't make the loop easier, but it changes how Alex approaches it. Instead of striving for the perfect decision, they begin to focus on understanding the people involved. They spend time talking to the individuals on the tracks, learning their stories, and connecting with them as human beings. Even though the loop resets and erases these interactions, Alex finds meaning in the act of empathy. By understanding the lives at stake, they gain a deeper appreciation for the complexity of morality. But the loop still doesn't end. No amount of learning or understanding seems to provide a way out. Alex wonders if the loop will continue forever, forcing them to confront this impossible choice until they lose all sense of themselves. They begin to fear that their values will erode completely, leaving them numb and indifferent. Yet, in the midst of this despair, they find small moments of clarity. The loop may be endless, but each iteration offers a chance to explore the nuances of human life and morality. In the end, the moral dilemma loop is less about finding the right answer and more about confronting the limits of moral reasoning. It forces Alex to acknowledge that some situations have no perfect solution, and that living with the consequences of our choices is an inevitable part of being human. The loop strips away the illusion of certainty and leaves only the raw, unfiltered reality of ethical decision-making. While Alex may never escape, they learn to embrace the ambiguity and find meaning in the struggle itself. Breaking out of a time loop requires precision and intention. The idea of escape velocity in this context borrows from physics, where an object must reach a certain speed to break free from a planet's gravitational pull. In a time loop, escaping means achieving a metaphorical velocity, a specific combination of actions, choices, or circumstances that lead to an exit. Time loops, whether seen in stories or theoretical discussions, hinge on repetition. The same day, the same hour, or even the same moment repeats endlessly, leaving the individual trapped in a cycle they must break. The challenge lies in determining how. Imagine waking up every day at 7 a.m., only to realize that no matter what you do, by midnight, everything resets. Your memories remain intact, but the world resets to its original state. You could spend the first few loops experimenting with small changes. Maybe you pour your coffee differently, say something unexpected to a colleague, or skip work entirely. None of these actions change the outcome. Midnight comes and the loop resets. Over time, you begin to notice patterns. Certain actions have ripple effects. If you help someone cross the street, their subsequent behavior shifts. If you avoid a conflict, others around you react differently. These observations build a mental map, revealing the mechanics of the loop. The key to escape often lies in these patterns. A time loop, in theory, functions like a puzzle. Each loop provides information or insight into what works and what doesn't. Suppose you find out that your neighbor, who rarely interacts with you, behaves unusually if you speak to them. Maybe they drop a hint about an event you hadn't considered important. Following this thread could lead to a larger discovery, a key to the loop's mechanics. By piecing together these details, you might uncover the steps required to break free. One scenario might involve resolving personal regrets or unfinished business. Stories often tie time loops to growth or resolution. If the loop revolves around a character learning to confront fears, repair relationships, or accept responsibility, breaking out might require completing those emotional arcs. For instance, if you're trapped in a loop because you never reconciled with an estranged sibling, escaping might depend on making amends. Each loop gives you a chance to refine the approach, finding the right words, timing, and actions to repair the bond. The process isn't linear. Missteps and failures abound, but the repetition offers endless opportunities to improve. In other cases, escape could hinge on an external trigger. Consider the possibility that the loop is tied to a specific event, like stopping a disaster, finding an artifact, or unraveling a mystery. Here, escape velocity takes on a literal meaning. You must gather enough momentum, knowledge, or resources to overcome the loop's grip. For example, you might discover that a particular event always occurs at 3 p.m. in every loop iteration, regardless of your actions. Investigating this event could reveal a clue, such as a person who knows more about the situation than they initially let on. By focusing on this event and its implications, you may uncover a pathway to escape. Sometimes, the loop involves a moral or ethical challenge. Escaping requires making a hard choice, one that might involve sacrifice or personal risk. Imagine you learn that stopping the loop demands you save someone at great cost to yourself. Perhaps you've been avoiding this decision out of fear or selfishness, but as the loops progress, you realize there's no alternative. Once you accept and act on this knowledge, the loop ends. This scenario underscores the emotional weight of escaping, where the solution isn't just about solving a puzzle, but confronting your inner self. The challenge often lies in the lack of clear rules. Time loops, as a concept, defy the laws of physics. They're hypothetical constructs, which means their mechanics can vary widely depending on the framework. In some interpretations, loops are deterministic, meaning every action and outcome are preordained. Escaping such a loop might seem impossible because the script is already written. Yet, even deterministic loops sometimes allow for a perfect run, where your actions align so precisely with the intended sequence that the loop breaks. Contrast this with loops that operate on chaos. In these scenarios, each iteration introduces new variables, making the loop unpredictable. Escaping chaotic loops requires adaptability and quick thinking. You might need to account for random elements, like a stranger's unexpected behavior or an unforeseen accident, which complicate your plans. The unpredictability forces you to develop a deeper understanding of the loop's underlying structure, identifying constants amid the chaos. Another complication is the psychological toll of repetition. Living the same day over and over can dull your senses, making it harder to stay motivated. Imagine spending 100 loops chasing leads that go nowhere. Frustration and apathy set in, tempting you to give up entirely. In these moments, the concept of velocity becomes crucial. Momentum isn't just about physical actions, but mental resilience. Staying focused, adapting to failure, and remaining curious are essential for escaping. Without this inner drive, even the clearest path out might remain undiscovered. For example, let's say you uncover a sequence of events that seems promising. You discover that giving a specific book to a stranger triggers a series of events that lead to a revelation about the loop. But after several attempts, the revelation proves incomplete. The stranger gives you cryptic hints, but no concrete answers. It's easy to feel discouraged, yet persistence might reveal the truth. Over dozens of loops, you could learn more about the stranger, where they're from, their motivations, and their connection to the loop. This persistence allows you to refine your approach, eventually cracking the puzzle. In some interpretations, the loop itself may resist your escape. Think of the loop as an active force, almost like a character. It might create obstacles to test your resolve or ensure you're ready for life outside its boundaries. If you try to brute force your way out through violence or recklessness, the loop might respond with harsher resets, like stripping you of certain advantages or introducing new complications. This creates a push and pull dynamic, where you must balance strategy and intuition to outwit the loop. An example of this resistance could involve a key character who becomes uncooperative. In one loop, they might willingly assist you, but in the next, they seem to have forgotten their role. Overcoming this challenge requires not just persistence, but creativity. Perhaps you need to approach the character from a different angle, earning their trust through an indirect method. This highlights the importance of flexibility and thinking outside conventional patterns. Ultimately, the concept of escape velocity boils down to achieving the right combination of actions, timing, and understanding. It's not enough to act randomly or repeat the same behaviors. Success comes from synthesizing everything learned across the loops, recognizing patterns, adapting to challenges, and pushing beyond comfort zones. Whether the loop involves personal growth, external problem solving, or moral dilemmas, the process of escaping is deeply tied to persistence and discovery. When the final loop occurs and you achieve escape, the moment carries immense weight. It represents not just freedom, but transformation. The experiences within the loop have shaped you, leaving a mark that lingers even as time resumes its normal flow. You're no longer the same person who first entered the loop. Breaking free is as much about internal change as external success, underscoring the intricate relationship between time, choice, and self-discovery. Time loops are a fascinating concept that challenge our understanding of reality and time. The idea of loop instability adds an extra layer of complexity to this phenomenon. In essence, loop instability suggests that a time loop cannot sustain itself indefinitely without consequences. Each iteration weakens the loop, introducing errors, inconsistencies, or even complete breakdowns until it eventually collapses. To understand this concept better, Imagine a time loop as a tape being played repeatedly. With each rewind and replay, the tape wears out, losing some of its quality. The same principle applies to the fabric of time within a loop. When a time loop begins, it may initially seem stable. Events unfold, time resets, and the loop starts again without any noticeable changes. For example, someone could wake up at the same moment every morning, live through the same day, and return to the same starting point. However, over time, subtle distortions begin to appear. These could be small at first, like a clock ticking a second slower than before, or a piece of furniture slightly out of place. As the loop continues to repeat, the distortions grow. These changes can manifest as larger disruptions, such as missing objects, altered memories, or even people behaving in ways they didn't during previous iterations. These anomalies signal that the loop is deteriorating. The reasons behind loop instability can be imagined in different ways, depending on the mechanism that sustains the loop. One possibility is that the loop depends on some kind of energy or force, which diminishes over time. As the energy depletes, the loop loses its structural integrity. Think of it like a battery running out of power. The loop starts strong, but with every iteration, it drains a little more until there is nothing left to sustain it. Another explanation could involve entropy, the natural tendency of systems to move toward disorder. In a time loop, the same sequence of events might seem to reset perfectly with every iteration, but in reality, small imperfections accumulate. These imperfections could result from interference by the loop's participants. If someone retains memories of previous loops, their actions will inevitably diverge from the original sequence. Over time, these deviations might ripple through the loop, destabilizing it. Even if the participants act the same every time, quantum-level randomness could still introduce microscopic variations that build up over countless iterations. Imagine a person trapped in a time loop who decides to experiment by doing things differently each time. On the surface, this might seem harmless, but each choice creates a divergence from the original timeline. For instance, they might choose to leave a book on a different shelf or say something they hadn't said before. At first, these changes seem inconsequential. But as the loop progresses, the cumulative effect of all these small choices could disrupt the loop's consistency, like tiny cracks forming in a dam. Eventually, the dam breaks, and the loop collapses under the weight of its own instability. The effects of loop instability may vary depending on how the collapse occurs. In some scenarios, the loop might end abruptly, ejecting participants into a single timeline that continues forward without resetting. This could be a relief for those trapped in the loop, finally offering an escape from endless repetition. However, the consequences of the instability might not be so benign. If the collapse is chaotic, it could result in catastrophic changes to reality. For example, merging fragments of different loop iterations could create a distorted world where events from various timelines coexist in conflict. In the worst-case scenario, the collapse could destroy the timeline entirely, leaving nothing behind. An intriguing aspect of loop instability is how it impacts those trapped within the loop. In stable loops, participants might retain their memories with each iteration, allowing them to grow and learn from the experience. But as the loop destabilizes, memory retention could become unreliable. A person might remember events from previous loops with increasing vagueness or confusion, making it difficult to navigate the situation. In extreme cases, participants might lose their memories altogether, resetting not only the timeline, but also their minds. This could make it impossible for them to recognize the loop's instability or take action to address it. Even if memory remains intact, participants may notice other unsettling changes. They might encounter people who behave strangely or fail to recognize them, even though they've interacted many times in previous loops. Physical objects might start to behave unpredictably, such as a car that refuses to start despite working perfectly in earlier iterations. These signs of instability can create a sense of unease and urgency, pushing participants to find a way out before the loop collapses entirely. The concept of loop instability also raises questions about the ethics of time manipulation. If someone creates or sustains a loop for personal gain, they might unintentionally harm the stability of the timeline. For For example, a scientist attempting to use a loop to prevent a disaster could inadvertently make things worse by causing the loop to destabilize. Each attempt to fix the loop might introduce new errors, compounding the problem. This creates a moral dilemma. Is it better to accept the timeline as it is, or risk destabilizing it in an effort to change it? To illustrate this further, consider a scenario where a time traveler creates a loop to save a loved one from an accident. Initially, the loop seems to offer a perfect solution. The time traveler resets the day until they successfully prevent the accident. However, the repeated resets introduce tiny inconsistencies. Perhaps the weather changes slightly, or the people involved make different choices. These small changes begin to spiral out of control, and the traveler realizes that each attempt to save their loved one brings the loop closer to collapse. They must decide whether to abandon their efforts and let the accident occur, or risk destroying the timeline entirely. Another fascinating aspect of loop instability is how it interacts with external forces. In some cases, the loop might not exist in isolation. Outside influences, such as other time travelers or natural phenomena, could disrupt the loop and accelerate its instability. For example, if a second time traveler enters the loop, their actions could interfere with the original sequence of events, creating conflicting timelines. Similarly, cosmic events like solar flares or black holes might interact with the loop's mechanism, introducing chaos into the system. These external factors add an unpredictable element to the loop, making its instability even more precarious. Despite its challenges, loop instability offers a glimmer of hope for those trapped in time. In some cases, the breakdown of the loop might be the only way to escape. Participants might need to intentionally destabilize the loop to force their way out, even if it comes with risks. For example, they could disrupt the sequence of events so drastically that the loop can no longer reset, creating an opportunity to escape into a new timeline. However, this strategy requires careful planning and a willingness to face the unknown. There is no guarantee that the timeline they emerge into will be better than the one they left behind. Ultimately, the concept of loop instability forces us to confront the fragile nature of time and the consequences of tampering with it. Time loops may seem like a playground for experimentation, but they come with hidden dangers. Every reset, every change, and every deviation chips away at the loop's foundation, creating a ticking time bomb. Whether it collapses into chaos or offers a path to freedom depends on the choices made by those trapped within. The idea of loop instability reminds us that time, like all things, has its limits. Parallel time loop theory suggests that each iteration of a time loop doesn't simply reset the same timeline, but instead creates a new parallel one. In this view, every time someone relives an event, they are actually stepping into a slightly different version of reality, branching off from the original. These variations can be minor, such as a book on a shelf being misplaced, or major, like entirely new events unfolding due to different decisions or random factors. Over time, this creates a network of parallel timelines, each distinct but originating from the same source. Imagine someone is stuck in a time loop where they repeatedly experience the same day. Let's say they wake up at 7 a.m., eat breakfast, head to work, and interact with the same people. If the loop resets at midnight, the next iteration might begin identically, but small choices like taking a different route to work could set off a chain reaction of changes. Perhaps that different route delays them by a few minutes, causing them to meet someone new or miss an important event. That small difference creates a unique version of the day, one that didn't exist before. As the loops continue, these changes compound, producing increasingly diverse outcomes. To better understand this theory, think of it like shuffling a deck of cards. Even if you start with the same deck, every shuffle creates a unique arrangement. Similarly, each time loop is like a new shuffle of reality, with elements staying the same in some ways but becoming different in others. Over countless iterations, the differences could grow so large that the new timelines bear little resemblance to the original. This concept can also help address the paradoxes often associated with time loops. One common paradox involves the idea of cause and effect. If someone makes a significant change during one loop, like saving a person who was previously destined to die, it could ripple through subsequent loops. In a single timeline model, this would create contradictions. How can someone be both alive and dead at the same time? But in the parallel loop theory, this problem doesn't arise. Each change spawns its own timeline, so there's no conflict. In one timeline, the person remains dead, in another, they survive. Both outcomes exist simultaneously, but in separate realities. A practical example of this might involve someone attempting to stop a disaster. Suppose a time traveler witnesses a catastrophic event, like a building collapsing. Determined to prevent it, they try a different approach in each loop. In one timeline, they might succeed in evacuating the building, saving hundreds of lives. In another, their actions might fail, and the building collapses as it did originally. Instead of erasing the failed attempt, the successful one becomes an entirely new branch of reality. Over countless loops, there could be a timeline for every possible way the event could unfold, from complete success to total failure. Parallel time loop theory also allows for the idea of multiple versions of the same person existing simultaneously. If every loop creates a new timeline, each version of the individual who initiated the loop could remain within their respective branch of reality. This raises interesting questions about identity and continuity. For example, if one version of a person escapes the loop, what happens to the others? Are they still trapped, endlessly reliving their timelines, or do they vanish? These questions have no definitive answers, but they highlight the profound philosophical implications of the theory. One way to think about this is through the lens of quantum mechanics. In the quantum world, particles can exist in multiple states at once, only choosing a single state when observed. Similarly, parallel time loops could function as a kind of quantum branching, where all possible outcomes coexist until someone escapes the loop or the loop itself ends. At that point, one version of reality might collapse into a single definitive timeline, or all the branches might continue independently. To illustrate this further, let's consider a character trapped in a loop who is trying to solve a murder mystery. Each time the loop resets, they use their accumulated knowledge to investigate a different suspect. In one iteration, they confront the victim's business partner and discover a motive, but fail to gather enough evidence to confirm guilt. In another, they focus on a family member and uncover a hidden grudge. Each investigation creates a new timeline, with different suspects implicated and different outcomes reached. Over many loops, the character builds a complete picture of the crime, but each piece of knowledge belongs to a separate version of reality. The question then becomes, which version is the real one, if any? This theory also challenges traditional ideas about free will. In a linear timeline, choices have fixed consequences. But in a parallel loop, every choice spawns a new reality, so all possible outcomes occur somewhere. This means that the individual in the loop is simultaneously free to choose and bound by the inevitability of creating every option. If they repeatedly try to make better decisions, they're not erasing the bad ones. They're simply adding more branches to the web of possibilities. The implications of this theory extend beyond the individual. If a single person in a loop can create infinite timelines, what happens to everyone else? Are they conscious of the branching, or do they remain unaware? In some versions of the theory, only the loop's initiator retains awareness, while everyone else resets without memory. In others, every person in the loop exists independently, creating their own branches. This could lead to a multiverse of nearly infinite complexity, where every person's actions and choices generate new realities. Let's return to the murder mystery example. If the protagonist's actions create new timelines, what happens to the suspects they confront in each one? In one timeline, a suspect might confess under pressure, while in another, they might deny everything. From the suspect's perspective, these divergent outcomes represent entirely different realities. Over many loops, the protagonist might encounter versions of the suspect who react with increasing hostility or resignation, depending on how many times they've been accused. This creates a dynamic interplay between the characters, where each interaction shapes the future of their respective timelines. Parallel time loop theory also offers a potential explanation for certain phenomena in science fiction, like déjà vu. If someone briefly becomes aware of their parallel timelines, they might experience a sense of familiarity or foreknowledge. This could explain why certain events feel eerily similar, or why people sometimes sense they've made a decision before. While purely speculative, this idea aligns with the theory's central premise, that all possible realities exist simultaneously, and our awareness is limited to just one at a time. The theory also raises ethical questions. If every loop creates a new timeline, what responsibility does the loop's initiator have for the outcomes of those branches? For example, if they save a life in one loop but inadvertently cause harm in another, are they morally accountable for both actions? This becomes even more complex if they're aware of the branching but unable to control it. In such cases, their efforts to do good might lead to unintended consequences, forcing them to confront the limits of their agency. Ultimately, parallel time loop theory provides a framework for understanding the complexities of time loops without resorting to contradictions or paradoxes. By viewing each iteration as a distinct branch of reality, it reconciles the idea of repeated events with the possibility of change. It also invites deeper exploration of identity, choice, and consequence, challenging our assumptions about time and reality. Whether or not it's scientifically plausible, the theory offers a compelling way to think about one of the most fascinating concepts in science fiction. A time traveler becomes fragmented across multiple iterations, with parts of their consciousness existing in different loops. Imagine someone stepping into a time loop expecting to relive a day or a moment repeatedly. The basic assumption is that the traveler's mind stays intact through each loop, holding memories of past iterations while the world resets around them. But what if that assumption is wrong? What if instead of a single, continuous mind traveling through these loops, the traveler's consciousness begins to fragment? Each iteration creates a version of their mind, leaving parts of them scattered across countless loops, with each version of their consciousness unaware of the others. This phenomenon, which we might call loop fragmentation, raises profound questions about identity, memory, and the cost of manipulating time. Imagine a man named Daniel caught in such a loop. On the first day, he realizes that time is reset, and as he wakes up to the same alarm, he remembers everything from the day before. At first, it feels like a gift. He learns to anticipate events before they happen, sidestep mistakes, and experiment with his choices. But after a few loops, he notices something strange. He begins to forget details. At first, it's minor. He forgets the exact words someone said or what he ate for breakfast in one iteration. Then it becomes more unsettling. Entire conversations, even decisions he made in previous loops, vanish from his memory. The more times the day repeats, the more fragmented his recollection becomes. What Daniel doesn't realize is that each time the loop resets, a new version of his consciousness emerges, distinct from the last. The previous version doesn't disappear entirely. It exists in some temporal layer tied to its own iteration of the loop, but it's cut off from the current one. As a result, Daniel becomes a patchwork of fragmented selves, each aware only of their specific loop and unaware of the others. From his perspective, it feels like his memories are fraying or being stolen, but the truth is far stranger. Each version of Daniel lives out its own iteration in isolation, with no way to communicate with or influence the others. This creates a unique kind of existential dilemma. Who in this situation is the real Daniel? If there are dozens, hundreds, or even thousands of versions of him existing in fragmented loops, each one experiencing its own slice of the loop timeline, does the concept of a singular, unified self even apply anymore? In one loop, Daniel might make the decision to save someone from an accident, while in another, he might decide to walk away. Each version is equally real and equally valid, but none of them can claim to be the definitive Daniel. Each consciousness operates independently, shaped by the events and choices of its own loop. Over time, Daniel starts noticing echoes of the other versions of himself. He might walk into a room and feel an overwhelming sense of déjà vu, as though he's done the exact same thing in a slightly different way. Perhaps he begins to hear faint whispers of thoughts that aren't his own, but feel eerily familiar. These aren't hallucinations. They're traces of the other iterations bleeding through, like cracks in the temporal fabric of the loop. In some cases, he might instinctively know how to solve a problem he's never encountered before, drawing on the experience of another version of himself, without understanding how or why. The situation becomes more complicated if the loop itself begins to break down. As Daniel's consciousness fragments further, the loops might start to overlap or diverge, creating scenarios where two or more versions of him interact. For instance, one iteration might leave behind a note or a message for the next, a desperate attempt to bridge the gap between them. Imagine Daniel finding a journal filled with handwriting he recognizes as his own, but has no memory of writing. In it, another version of him might have detailed events and choices from past loops, trying to pass on knowledge to future iterations. But even this method is imperfect. The fragments of his consciousness are too disconnected to fully understand or trust one another, and conflicting accounts in the journal might lead to confusion or even paranoia. The psychological toll of this fragmentation cannot be overstated. For Daniel, it feels like he's losing himself piece by piece. Each loop chips away at his sense of continuity, leaving him questioning whether he's still the same person who entered the loop in the first place. The weight of knowing that countless other versions of himself exist, each isolated and unable to communicate with him, becomes unbearable. It's not just the repetition of events that wears him down. It's the knowledge that he's not whole anymore, that his mind has been shattered into countless pieces scattered across time. To understand the mechanics of loop fragmentation, we need to consider the nature of consciousness within a time loop. Typically, we assume that consciousness is like a thread, continuous and unbroken, that moves through time with the traveler. But if time resets completely in a loop, it might also reset the conditions that generate consciousness. This would mean that each iteration creates a new instance of the traveler's mind, tied to the loop it inhabits. In most cases, these instances would be indistinguishable from one another, as they'd share the same memories and personality. However, if any element of the loop allows for memory retention, the illusion of continuity is broken, revealing the fragmented nature of consciousness. In Daniel's case, the fragmentation might also result from imperfections in the loop itself. Time loops, by their very nature, are unstable constructs. They rely on precise conditions to reset the timeline without disrupting the traveler's consciousness. If those conditions are even slightly flawed, perhaps due to external interference or the natural degradation of the loop over time, it could lead to the kind of fragmentation Daniel experiences. Each new iteration becomes slightly less connected to the previous one, creating a cascade of disjointed consciousness. This idea also challenges our understanding of identity. If Daniel's consciousness is fragmented across multiple loops, and each version of him makes different choices and experiences different outcomes, who is the real Daniel? Is he the sum of all these fragmented selves, or is each version an independent entity with its own claim to existence? The answer may depend on how we define identity. If we see it as a continuous thread, then loop fragmentation effectively destroys Daniel's sense of self. But if we see identity as something that can exist in multiple forms simultaneously, then each version of him is equally valid. To escape the loop, Daniel would need to find a way to unify these fragments, to somehow bridge the gaps between the isolated iterations of his consciousness. This might involve creating a mechanism within the loop that allows for full memory retention, or finding a way to break free of the loop entirely. Either way, the process would require him to confront the fractured nature of his identity and reconcile the countless versions of himself that exist across the loop. In the end, loop fragmentation is not just a story about time travel. It's a meditation on the nature of selfhood and the fragility of memory. It forces us to ask difficult questions about who we are and what it means to be whole. For Daniel, the journey to escape the loop is not just about breaking free from time. It's about reclaiming the pieces of himself that have been lost along the way. In an observer-dependent time loop, the phenomenon of time repeating itself is experienced solely by the observer, while the rest of the world progresses as though nothing unusual is happening. For everyone else, time continues in a straight line, consistent with their understanding of reality. This situation creates a deeply isolating experience for the person trapped in the loop. The observer is the only one aware of the repetition, bearing the weight of knowledge and action, while others remain blissfully unaware. This concept raises questions about perception, causality, and the psychological toll of being alone in a cycle of repeating events. Imagine a man named Daniel wakes up one morning to find himself stuck in a time loop. Every day, at precisely midnight, the world resets, and Daniel wakes up to the same day. To him, everything is exactly as it was the first time he lived it. The sun rises at the same time, the weather is the same, and the people around him say and do the same things. Yet, for everyone else, time appears normal. They live their lives without interruption, unaware that anything strange is happening. Only Daniel retains his memories of previous iterations of the day. This creates an immediate sense of detachment for him, as he realizes that any relationships, connections, or progress he makes during the loop are erased at midnight. Daniel initially tries to explain what is happening to the people around him. He tells his wife, his coworkers, and even strangers about the loop. But to them, he seems unhinged. They have no memory of the events Daniel recounts because, from their perspective, those events haven't happened. Daniel might try proving his claims by predicting the immediate future, describing a car accident seconds before it happens, or reciting someone's exact words before they speak. While this shocks people in the moment, the reset at midnight erases all their reactions, leaving Daniel back at square one. The isolation deepens as Daniel realizes that he cannot truly share his experience with anyone. He is alone in a reality where time has no meaning except to him. This isolation is further compounded by the fact that Daniel cannot rely on others to help him escape the loop. If he seeks advice or assistance, he must repeat the explanation every day, only for those conversations to be forgotten when time resets. This creates a scenario where his relationships lose their depth and authenticity. While Daniel grows increasingly familiar with those around him, learning their secrets, habits, and vulnerabilities, they remain oblivious to his struggle. To them, Daniel is meeting them for the first time, no matter how many times he has lived the same day. Over time, this asymmetry in knowledge and experience causes Daniel to see the people around him as hollow versions of themselves, mere actors performing the same roles without awareness. The psychological effects of being trapped in an observer-dependent loop are profound. At first, Daniel might find the situation intriguing, even empowering. He has the opportunity to take risks without consequences, knowing that any mistake will be erased when the loop resets. He might rob a bank, confess his deepest secrets, or indulge in reckless behavior simply because he can. But as the novelty wears off, the weight of his isolation begins to take its toll. Without the ability to make lasting changes or form meaningful connections, life begins to feel futile. Each day becomes a reminder that his actions lack permanence, and the repetition erodes his sense of purpose. Over time, Daniel might experiment with different approaches to escape the loop. He might try altering his behavior, hoping that a specific set of actions will break the cycle. He could attempt to leave town, imagining that the loop is tied to a specific location. He might even resort to extreme measures, like harming himself, to see if death offers a way out. But regardless of what he tries, the result is always the same. He wakes up to the same day, trapped in a pattern he cannot control. This leads to a sense of helplessness and frustration, as Daniel realizes that he is at the mercy of a phenomenon he doesn't understand. One of the most challenging aspects of an observer-dependent loop is the lack of external validation. Daniel has no one to confirm his experience or offer reassurance. He cannot share the burden of his knowledge, which forces him to internalize his struggle. This isolation creates a disconnect between Daniel and the world around him. While everyone else continues with their lives, oblivious to the loop, Daniel becomes increasingly detached from reality. His memories of previous iterations accumulate, creating a mental archive of events that no one else remembers. This creates a unique form of loneliness, as Daniel is surrounded by people, yet fundamentally alone in his experience. Despite the hardships, the situation also presents opportunities for growth. Over countless iterations of the same day, Daniel has the chance to examine his life in extraordinary detail. He can replay interactions to better understand his relationships, confront personal flaws, and explore possibilities he would never have considered under normal circumstances. The loop becomes a mirror, forcing Daniel to confront his identity and choices. While the experience is isolating, it also offers a rare opportunity for self-reflection. In this sense, the loop serves as both a prison and a crucible, shaping Daniel in ways that might not have been possible otherwise. Eventually, Daniel might come to accept his situation, finding a sense of peace in the repetition. While he cannot escape the loop or share his experience, he can control how he responds to it. By focusing on small, meaningful actions, Daniel might discover a sense of purpose within the confines of his reality. For example, he could use his knowledge of the day's events to help others, even if they won't remember his efforts. He might prevent accidents, offer kindness to strangers, or simply observe the world with a deeper appreciation. In doing so, Daniel reclaims a sense of agency, even in the face of a seemingly inescapable cycle. The concept of an observer-dependent loop raises interesting philosophical questions. If the loop exists only for the observer, what does that say about the nature of time and reality? Is Daniel's experience less valid because it is not shared by others? Does the isolation of the loop make his actions meaningless, or do they still hold value despite their impermanence? These questions challenge our understanding of existence, forcing us to consider the role of memory, connection, and purpose in shaping our lives. Ultimately, an observer-dependent loop highlights the power of perspective. While the phenomenon isolates Daniel from the world, it also grants him a unique vantage point. He sees time in a way that others cannot, experiencing life as a series of interconnected moments rather than a linear progression. This perspective allows him to appreciate the subtleties of each day, the way sunlight filters through the trees, the rhythm of a stranger's footsteps, or the sound of laughter in the distance. In a world where time resets endlessly, these small details become treasures, reminding Daniel that even in isolation, life retains its beauty. Temporal echoes occur when actions in earlier iterations of a time loop leave subtle traces or effects that influence subsequent repetitions. These traces can manifest as physical changes, emotional imprints, or shifts in behavior among the individuals involved. Understanding temporal echoes requires examining how time loops interact with causality and memory, as well as considering the ways in which seemingly insignificant actions might ripple outward, creating lasting effects that extend across repeated iterations of the same events. Imagine a person trapped in a time loop. Each day, they wake up in the same bed at the same time, reliving the exact same sequence of events. However, as they navigate each loop, they notice small, almost imperceptible differences. For example, a coffee mug that was always on the counter in previous loops might now be slightly out of place. A friend who typically greets them warmly might seem distracted or irritable for no apparent reason. These differences could be explained by temporal echoes, residual effects from actions taken in earlier loops that subtly influence the current iteration. To illustrate this concept more clearly, let's consider a specific scenario. A man named James is reliving the same day over and over. In one loop, he decides to help an elderly neighbor carry groceries into her house. The act seems inconsequential at the time, and when the loop resets, James expects everything to return to its original state. However, on the next iteration, he notices that the neighbor now waves to him warmly when she sees him, even though he hasn't yet repeated the act of helping her. This change suggests that some trace of his earlier action has persisted, influencing the neighbor's behavior in a way that shouldn't be possible if the loop were truly resetting everything to its initial state. Temporal echoes challenge our understanding of causality in time loops. Traditional theories of time loops assume that each iteration begins as a perfect reset, erasing all previous actions and restoring the timeline to its original state. However, if echoes exist, this means that time loops are not entirely clean slates. Instead, they may retain subtle imprints of past events, creating a layered effect where each iteration is slightly influenced by the ones that came before it. This raises important questions about the nature of time loops. Are they truly self-contained, or are they part of a larger, interconnected temporal framework that allows for the accumulation of residual effects? The mechanics of temporal echoes might be tied to the concept of memory. In many stories about time loops, the person trapped in the loop retains their memory of previous iterations, allowing them to learn, adapt, and make different choices each time. But what if the loop itself has a kind of memory? Even if the timeline resets, the environment or individuals within it might subconsciously remember actions that occurred in earlier loops. This could explain why changes like the displaced coffee mug or the neighbor's behavior persist, even though the loop ostensibly resets everything to its starting conditions. Another way to think about temporal echoes is to consider them as a form of resonance. Just as a bell continues to vibrate after being struck, a time loop might carry the vibrations of past actions into future iterations. This resonance could manifest in subtle ways, such as patterns of behavior, emotional responses, or physical changes in the environment. For example, if someone repeatedly rearranges furniture in a particular room during multiple loops, they might eventually find that the room feels different or unfamiliar, even if they haven't made the changes in the current iteration. The repeated action creates a kind of imprint, subtly altering the way the space feels over time. The presence of temporal echoes also opens up fascinating possibilities for storytelling. Imagine a character who begins to notice these echoes and uses them to their advantage. They might leave hidden messages for themselves, knowing that the loop will reset, but hoping that some trace of the message will persist. For instance, they could carve a message into a tree, and while the tree might appear unmarked in the next loop, the character might still experience a vague sense of familiarity or intuition when they pass by it. This could become a powerful tool for breaking out of the loop, as the character learns to harness the echoes to guide their actions. On the other hand, temporal echoes could also create complications and unintended consequences. If a character unknowingly creates echoes, they might find themselves dealing with unexpected changes that make it harder to navigate the loop. For example, if someone acts aggressively toward a colleague in one loop, the echo of that action might make the colleague more hostile in subsequent iterations, even if the character tries to make amends. This could lead to a cascading effect, where small actions in early loops snowball into significant challenges over time. The concept of temporal echoes also raises ethical questions. If actions in a loop have lasting effects, does this mean that the person trapped in the loop bears responsibility for those effects? In a typical time loop scenario, the protagonist often operates under the assumption that their actions have no lasting consequences, because everything resets at the end of the loop. This freedom allows them to experiment, take risks, and make mistakes without fear of permanent repercussions. However, if echoes exist, this changes the moral calculus. The person in the loop must now consider the potential long-term impact of their choices, even if they are the only one who remembers previous iterations. One way to explore these ethical dilemmas is to imagine a scenario where a character uses the loop to their advantage, manipulating others to achieve their goals. Over time, they begin to notice that their manipulations leave echoes, subtly altering the behavior and attitudes of the people around them. This realization forces the character to confront the consequences of their actions and consider whether their pursuit of personal gain is worth the harm it might cause to others, even within the confines of the loop. From a scientific perspective, the existence of temporal echoes could suggest that time loops operate on principles similar to quantum mechanics, where particles can influence one another across time and space. In this framework, the loop might not be a closed system, but rather a dynamic one, with information and energy flowing between iterations in ways that we don't fully understand. This could provide a basis for exploring how temporal echoes work and what they reveal about the nature of time itself. In summary, temporal echoes add depth and complexity to the concept of time loops by introducing the idea that actions in earlier iterations can leave lasting traces. These traces might manifest as physical changes, emotional shifts, or subtle patterns of behavior, challenging the assumption that time loops always reset everything to their original state. By exploring the mechanics and implications of temporal echoes, we gain new insights into the interplay between causality, memory, and responsibility in time loops. Whether used as a narrative device or a thought experiment, Temporal echoes invite us to consider how even the smallest actions can ripple outward, leaving a mark that persists across time. In a time loop, where events repeat endlessly and the individual remains aware of each cycle, a fascinating possibility emerges: the ability to accumulate skills infinitely. This is the premise of the infinite learning loop. Each repetition of time offers a fresh opportunity to practice, refine, and master abilities without any of the usual constraints that limit human learning, like aging, exhaustion, or the finite nature of time itself. The loop resets everything external, but the person inside retains their knowledge and skills. Over countless iterations, this scenario allows someone to become a master of all trades, achieving a level of expertise that would be impossible in a normal linear life. Imagine a person waking up to the same day over and over, as if trapped in a movie scene that refuses to move forward. They start by noticing small details: the alarm clock's beep, the sound of traffic outside, or the exact timing of a neighbor's footsteps on the stairs. At first, these repetitions might feel tedious or frustrating. However, as the person begins to understand the loop's potential, they realize that this situation isn't a curse, but an opportunity. With time resetting every day, any mistake they make has no long-term consequences. They can fail, learn, and try again without the usual fear of wasting precious time. Every moment becomes an open door for exploration and growth. Take, for example, the simple act of learning to play the piano. In the real world, becoming proficient at the piano might take years of dedicated practice. But in a time loop, the concept of years doesn't apply. Someone trapped in a loop could dedicate hundreds or even thousands of loops to practicing scales, memorizing sheet music, and experimenting with different techniques. At the end of each day, their physical progress on the instrument would vanish as time resets, but their knowledge and muscle memory would remain intact. Over countless iterations, they could achieve a level of mastery that rivals or exceeds lifelong professionals. This principle extends beyond music. Any skill, whether it's painting, cooking, martial arts, or even speaking new languages, can be mastered through the endless repetitions of a time loop. The person trapped in the loop has no deadlines, no obligations, and no external pressures. They can focus entirely on learning, failing, and improving. Each loop becomes a clean slate, free of judgment or consequence, where the only thing that matters is progress. Let's consider a more complex scenario. Imagine someone in a loop decides to master medicine. They start by reading books and watching online lectures, gradually building a foundation of knowledge. Once they feel ready, they might practice by volunteering at a hospital or shadowing doctors. With each reset, they could push themselves further, learning new procedures, observing different cases, and refining their skills. Although the loop erases their physical actions, their mental growth remains, allowing them to approach each new iteration with greater confidence and expertise. Over time, they could amass the knowledge and skill of a seasoned surgeon, even if the world outside the loop remains unaware of their progress. This ability to accumulate skills has profound psychological implications. At first, the individual might feel excitement at the prospect of infinite learning. The loop provides a rare freedom to explore hobbies and interests without the constraints of time or responsibility. However, as the iterations continue, a sense of purpose might come into question. Why bother mastering these skills if the world resets every day? Who benefits from their expertise if no one else remembers their accomplishments? These existential doubts could push the person toward a deeper understanding of self-motivation and fulfillment. Consider another example. Someone decides to learn social skills in the loop. Interpersonal interactions often come with risks: saying the wrong thing, offending someone, or appearing awkward. In a time loop, those risks vanish. The person could experiment endlessly with conversations, trying out different approaches and observing the outcomes. Over time, they could become exceptionally skilled at reading body language, navigating conflicts, and building connections. Even though the loop erases their interactions, their ability to communicate effectively would remain. This could lead to a level of charisma and emotional intelligence that transforms their understanding of relationships. The infinite learning loop also raises intriguing ethical questions. For instance, could someone use the loop to acquire skills that harm others? Learning how to manipulate, deceive, or exploit people might be just as easy as learning constructive skills. Without external consequences, a person might feel tempted to explore morally ambiguous paths. Over time, however, the repetition might act as a moral reset, giving the individual countless opportunities to reflect on their actions and choose a different path. In this sense, the loop becomes a tool for both self-improvement and self-discovery, forcing the individual to confront their values and priorities. Another fascinating aspect of the loop is the way it reshapes the concept of mastery. In the real world, becoming an expert often requires years of dedication and sacrifice. People must balance their learning with other responsibilities like work, family, and health. In a time loop, those responsibilities disappear. The person can devote their full attention to any skill they choose without worrying about the cost. This allows for a level of focus and dedication that is rarely possible in normal life. Yet mastery in the loop isn't just about repetition. It also requires creativity and adaptability. Simply repeating the same actions over and over won't lead to improvement if the person doesn't learn from their mistakes. The loop challenges them to approach problems from different angles, experiment with new strategies, and push themselves beyond their comfort zone. This iterative process of trial and error is what drives true growth, turning the loop into a dynamic learning environment rather than a static cycle. Over time, the individual might find themselves drawn to unexpected interests. They might start with practical skills, like cooking or woodworking, but gradually shift toward more abstract pursuits, like philosophy or mathematics. The loop provides a rare chance to explore the full range of human knowledge, unbound by the usual constraints of time and necessity. This journey of exploration could lead to a profound appreciation for the diversity and complexity of human achievement. Despite its limitless potential, the infinite learning loop also carries risks. The lack of external consequences might lead to complacency or a sense of futility. Without a clear goal or purpose, the individual could lose motivation, falling into a routine of endless repetition without progress. Escaping this trap requires a strong sense of self-discipline and curiosity, as well as the ability to set meaningful goals within the loop. Ultimately, the infinite learning loop is a thought experiment that highlights the extraordinary potential of human learning. It forces us to imagine what we could achieve if time and consequences weren't obstacles. While the idea of being trapped in a loop might seem daunting, it also offers a unique perspective on growth and mastery. By embracing the opportunities within the loop, the individual can transform what seems like a curse into a profound journey of self-discovery and development. A cosmic reset loop is a fascinating concept where time resets not just for an individual, but for the entire universe. Imagine living your life, watching history unfold, and building a future, only for the entire timeline of existence to rewind to the very beginning. Everything that ever existed, stars, galaxies, civilizations, and even the tiniest particles, gets undone. Then it all starts again, as if nothing had ever happened. The loop doesn't just affect a specific moment or a small group of people. It engulfs the entirety of time and space. Every atom in existence reverts to its original state, and every event that once occurred begins anew. To fully grasp the implications of a cosmic reset loop, let's think about what it would mean for the nature of time and progress. In most traditional stories about time loops, the focus is on a single individual or a specific group of people trapped in a cycle. They might wake up every morning to the same day or relive a short sequence of events repeatedly. But in a cosmic reset loop, the scope is staggeringly larger. This isn't just about one person being aware of the loop. It's about everything, literally everything, being caught in an endless cycle of creation, evolution, destruction, and recreation. Imagine, for example, that the universe is like a massive computer program. At some point, whether because of a glitch, a design, or an external force, the program resets itself entirely. The Big Bang happens all over again, and the universe expands, forms stars, creates planets, and eventually gives rise to life, just as it did before. In this loop, every event that ever occurred will happen again in exactly the same way, or close to it. You might live your entire life, make choices, and leave a legacy, only to have it all erased and replaced by the exact same sequence of events. But there's an intriguing question here. What happens to awareness in such a loop? If you are living in a cosmic reset loop, would you know? Let's say you are a conscious being, a human, for instance. You live through an entire lifetime experiencing joy, sadness, love, and loss. When the universe resets, everything returns to the way it was at the start of time. Your birth, growth, and death will play out again. However, it's possible you wouldn't retain any memory of the previous loop. From your perspective, everything would feel brand new. This lack of awareness might make the loop imperceptible, an invisible phenomenon affecting the entire cosmos without anyone realizing it. On the other hand, what if some level of awareness persists? Imagine you begin to experience flashes of déjà vu, a sense that you've lived this life before. At first, it might be subtle. Maybe you feel strangely certain about outcomes, or you predict events without understanding why. Over time, you might realize that you're reliving the same universal timeline over and over. That awareness could lead to a cascade of questions. If the loop is unbreakable, would knowing about it bring despair? Or would it encourage you to make the most of your time, knowing that everything will inevitably reset? Consider, too, the implications for civilization and scientific discovery. Humanity has spent millennia striving to understand the nature of the universe. We've mapped stars, harnessed energy, built societies, and created art. In a cosmic reset loop, all of that progress would vanish with every reset. Imagine an advanced civilization that reaches the pinnacle of technological and philosophical understanding, only for the universe to rewind itself completely. All the knowledge, the breakthroughs, and the growth would be erased in an instant, resetting to the primordial state of the cosmos. In such a reality, progress becomes an illusion, a temporary state that always circles back to the starting point. But what if the loop isn't a perfect repeat? Let's entertain the idea that small variations occur with each reset. In one iteration, a specific star might form slightly earlier than it did in the last loop. This small change could ripple outward, creating entirely new outcomes. On a planet like Earth, this might mean different species evolve, or humanity follows a different trajectory. These slight deviations could lead to a multiverse-like situation where every loop spawns a unique version of the universe. It's still a reset, but it's not identical each time. In a way, this idea of slight variation creates room for hope. If you were aware of the loop, you might strive to create a better version of events in each iteration. Let's say you're an individual in such a universe, and over countless resets, you slowly begin to remember fragments of past cycles. You might recall mistakes you made, wars that could have been prevented, or discoveries that were overlooked. Armed with this growing awareness, you could try to nudge the timeline toward a more positive outcome, even within the confines of the loop. Of course, there's no guarantee that such efforts would succeed. The loop might still override your intentions, pulling everything back into the same patterns, but the possibility of change could give meaning to what would otherwise be a cycle of futility. Now, let's examine the cause of such a loop. What could make the universe reset itself? One theory might involve the laws of physics. Perhaps there's a mechanism built into the fabric of reality that triggers a reset under certain conditions. For instance, the universe might expand to a certain size and then collapse in on itself, leading to another Big Bang. This cyclical model of the universe, often called the Big Bounce, suggests that the cosmos has been looping infinitely through cycles of expansion and contraction. Another possibility is the involvement of an external force or intelligence. What if the universe is part of a simulation and the reset is initiated by whoever or whatever is running it? In this scenario, the loop might serve a purpose, perhaps as a form of experimentation, allowing the simulated universe to run countless iterations to explore different possibilities. Alternatively, the reset might be accidental, the result of a flaw in the system. Finally, there's the philosophical angle. A cosmic reset loop forces us to confront the nature of meaning and existence. If everything we do is erased and repeated, does anything truly matter? For some, the answer might be yes. Even if the loop undoes all progress, the experiences and emotions we have within each iteration still hold value. For others, the idea of an eternal reset might seem disheartening, as it suggests an absence of lasting purpose. But perhaps there's a middle ground. maybe the loop itself is the purpose. If the universe is destined to reset infinitely, then every moment within it becomes part of a larger, ongoing process. Each iteration contributes to the whole, like a single frame in a movie. From our limited perspective, the loop might seem confining, but on a cosmic scale, it could be an essential part of existence. A cosmic reset loop is more than just a theoretical curiosity. It's a concept that invites us to reconsider how we view time, progress, and purpose. Whether we imagine it as an unbreakable cycle, a chance for small variations, or a philosophical puzzle, the idea challenges us to think beyond the linear flow of time we take for granted. It's a reminder that the universe, vast and complex as it is, might operate in ways that are fundamentally different from what we expect. And in that mystery, there's a certain beauty, a recognition that existence, even in its repetitive form, remains profound and awe-inspiring. Time loops are a fascinating concept, but the psychological and emotional toll they might take on an individual trapped within one is often overlooked. Endless repetition, while it might seem like an opportunity to improve, learn, or explore without consequence, could instead lead to a profound deterioration of mental and emotional well-being. This idea, known as loop fatigue theory, explores the consequences of living the same events over and over, potentially forever. Imagine waking up every day to find that nothing has changed. The people you know are unaware of the cycle. They follow the same patterns, say the same words, and make the same choices. At first, it might seem like an opportunity, a chance to test out scenarios, to say things you were afraid to say, to correct mistakes, or to perfect your decisions. But over time, the novelty fades. The realization sets in. Nothing you do will have lasting meaning. No relationship you form, no success you achieve, and no mistake you correct will extend beyond the boundaries of the loop. This awareness begins to gnaw at a person's mind. With repetition comes a sense of futility. Actions lose their weight when their consequences are repeatedly erased. Even the most exciting or joyful experiences begin to dull after countless iterations. A sunset that once moved you to tears becomes just another predictable moment in an unchanging series of days. The human mind thrives on novelty and progress, but in a time loop, these are stripped away. The same stimuli, the same events, and the same outcomes inevitably lead to stagnation. The emotional impact of such stagnation could vary depending on the person. For some, the lack of forward momentum might bring despair. The absence of meaningful growth or change could feel like a prison, even if the loop contains no physical walls. For others, the repeated failure to escape the loop could lead to frustration and anger. No matter how many times they try to break free, they always wake up at the same starting point, as if their efforts were irrelevant. This sense of powerlessness, repeated endlessly, could lead to severe mental distress. One of the most profound challenges for anyone trapped in a time loop would be the loneliness. Even in a world full of people, the person in the loop is alone in their knowledge of the cycle. They cannot confide in anyone without the certainty that the conversation will be erased when the loop resets. Relationships, which are often central to human happiness, would become shallow and temporary. Even if a connection feels genuine during one iteration, it is lost when the loop resets. Over time, this could lead to emotional detachment. Why invest in relationships or conversations when they will be undone as soon as the day restarts? To illustrate this further, imagine someone trapped in a time loop for what feels like years, though no time passes for the rest of the world. At first, they might try to share their predicament, hoping someone could offer advice or help. But as the same conversations play out, they would realize the futility of seeking understanding. They might grow distant from others, retreating into isolation. This solitude, compounded by endless repetition, could amplify feelings of depression, hopelessness, and even resentment toward those who unknowingly participate in the unchanging cycle. Another challenge of a time loop is the loss of identity. People often define themselves by their goals, relationships, and achievements, but these are all rendered meaningless in a loop. Without the ability to create a lasting legacy or to grow in any tangible way, a person's sense of self might begin to erode. Who are you, after all, if nothing you do matters? Are you still the same person after living the same day 1,000 times, or has the loop fundamentally changed you? This existential question could weigh heavily on someone trapped in such a scenario, pushing them further into despair. There is also the danger of moral degradation. With no long-term consequences for actions, someone in a time loop might begin to experiment with behaviors they would never consider otherwise. If their actions are erased at the end of each loop, they might rationalize that it doesn't matter how they behave. This could lead to increasingly reckless or harmful decisions. Over time, they might lose touch with their ethical compass, justifying harmful actions as a way to break the monotony or test the boundaries of the loop. Such behavior, even if reversible at the loop's reset, could leave lasting psychological scars. On the other hand, some might approach the loop with a sense of determination, treating it as a puzzle to solve. But even this mindset has its limits. Endless failure to escape could erode a person's resolve. Trying every conceivable method, science, magic, brute force, persuasion, only to wake up at the same starting point each time would wear down even the most optimistic individual. They might begin to doubt their ability to find a solution or question whether escape is even possible. In rare cases, someone might adapt to the loop, finding ways to make peace with their situation. They might focus on small joys or use the loop as an opportunity to learn and grow, even if their progress resets with each cycle. However, this approach requires an extraordinary level of mental resilience and acceptance. For most people, the repetitive nature of a loop would still pose a significant psychological challenge, even if they found ways to cope. For example, consider a musician trapped in a time loop. At first, they use the endless repetition to master their craft, practicing for what amounts to decades without aging a day. They become a virtuoso, able to play any piece flawlessly. But over time, even this achievement feels hollow. Their skill exists only within the loop. No one outside the cycle will ever hear them play. The sense of accomplishment that once motivated them fades, replaced by a gnawing awareness of their isolation. This sense of futility and loss could eventually lead to apathy. When nothing matters and nothing changes, the natural response might be to stop caring altogether. Someone in a loop might give up entirely, going through the motions without any effort or enthusiasm. This emotional numbness, born of endless repetition, could be the most profound form of suffering in a time loop. Loop fatigue theory underscores the psychological weight of an endless cycle. While the concept of a time loop might seem intriguing at first, the reality of living the same events repeatedly would likely lead to significant emotional and mental deterioration. Without novelty, growth, or meaningful connection, the human mind struggles to find purpose. A time loop, then, is not just a puzzle to be solved, but a test of resilience and identity. For those trapped within one, the greatest challenge might not be escaping the loop itself, but preserving their sense of self in the face of endless repetition. The observer fusion paradox is a theoretical scenario where multiple versions of the same individual, each from different iterations of a time loop, combine into a single entity. This fusion occurs as a consequence of repeated loop iterations and introduces unique challenges to the concept of personal identity, continuity, and the stability of time itself. Understanding this paradox requires delving into the nature of time loops, how consciousness interacts with time, and what happens when separate iterations of the same person converge into one being. Imagine a time loop where a person, let's call them Alex, relives the same day over and over. Each time the loop resets, Alex retains their memories of the previous iteration. Over time, Alex might accumulate hundreds or even thousands of days' worth of memories and experiences, making them drastically different from the version of themselves that started the loop. Now, consider a situation where the timeline becomes unstable due to an anomaly, causing these versions of Alex to collapse into one unified consciousness. Instead of retaining only the most recent iteration's memories, Alex now holds every experience from every loop iteration simultaneously. This fusion doesn't simply add the memories together, it combines every thought, decision, and emotional response from those iterations into a single entity. This paradox presents a profound challenge to the concept of identity. Normally, a person experiences life as a continuous sequence of events, one moment leading logically into the next. Even when memories from earlier loops are retained, The individual perceives them as part of a single linear identity. But when multiple versions of the same person are fused together, this continuity is broken. Alex would no longer be one person experiencing time in a linear fashion. Instead, Alex becomes a composite of countless different versions of themselves, each shaped by slightly different choices and circumstances. The result is a fragmented consciousness struggling to reconcile these disparate experiences. For example, one version of Alex might have spent hundreds of loops making altruistic choices, while another might have acted selfishly or even maliciously. When these versions fuse, their conflicting values, emotions, and memories create internal turmoil. Alex would remember both the selfless and selfish actions as their own, leading to confusion about who they truly are. The more loops Alex has lived through, the more complicated this fusion becomes. It's not just a matter of reconciling memories. It's about integrating vastly different versions of morality, personality, and life experiences into one cohesive self. This paradox also raises questions about how the mind can handle such an overwhelming influx of information. The human brain has limitations. It can only process so much data before it becomes overloaded. If Alex suddenly gains the memories and perspectives of thousands of past iterations, their mind might struggle to function. This could manifest as cognitive dissonance, where conflicting thoughts and beliefs clash, making it difficult for Alex to make decisions or even think clearly. In extreme cases, the sheer volume of information might cause Alex's mind to break down entirely, rendering them incapable of functioning as a coherent individual. Temporal instability adds another layer of complexity. Time loops are already precarious constructs, existing on the edge of causality and logic. Introducing a fusion of multiple iterations disrupts this balance. Each version of Alex represents a slightly different timeline, a unique path through the loop. Combining them into one entity effectively merges these timelines, creating a tangled web of overlapping events and outcomes. This could destabilize the loop itself, causing it to unravel or collapse. The paradox arises from the fact that these versions of Alex are not supposed to exist simultaneously, let alone as a single being. Their fusion defies the rules of linear time and creates a feedback loop of temporal anomalies. A scenario where this paradox unfolds might go something like this. Alex has been stuck in a time loop for 1,000 days. Each loop resets the world, but Alex keeps their memories. Over time, they try different approaches to escape, helping others, focusing on self-improvement, or even descending into apathy and recklessness. One day, an unknown variable destabilizes the loop, and instead of resetting normally, all of Alex's previous selves collapse into one. Suddenly, Alex isn't just one person who remembers 1,000 days. They are 1,000 versions of themselves, all existing simultaneously within a single mind. At first, Alex might struggle to understand what's happening. They would hear the voices of their other selves, each with its own perspective on the events of the loop. The altruistic versions might urge Alex to act selflessly, while the selfish versions argue for personal gain. Even simple decisions, like whether to help a stranger or ignore them, become battles between conflicting impulses. Alex would feel emotions they can't explain, driven by memories they didn't just remember, but actively live in their mind. The fusion turns every thought into a cacophony of competing desires, making it nearly impossible to act decisively. Over time, Alex might adapt, learning to integrate these fragmented selves into a new, unified identity. They could try to find common ground among their many iterations, focusing on shared goals or values that transcend the differences. However, this process would be fraught with challenges. Reconciling thousands of different lives into one cohesive self is no small task, and it's unlikely that Alex would emerge unchanged. They might lose their original sense of identity, becoming something entirely new, a composite being shaped by countless lifetimes of experience. The implications of the observer fusion paradox extend beyond Alex's personal struggle. If the fusion destabilizes the time loop, it could have far-reaching consequences for the timeline itself. For instance, the fusion might create ripple effects that alter the past or future, leading to unforeseen changes in the broader world. Alternatively, the loop might collapse entirely, breaking the cycle of repetition, but leaving Alex and the timeline in an unstable state. In either case, the paradox demonstrates how fragile the boundaries of time and identity can become when pushed to their limits. This paradox also touches on philosophical questions about what it means to be an individual. If Alex is now a fusion of all their past selves, can they still be considered the same person? Or have they become something entirely different, a new entity born from the collapse of the loop? The answer depends on how we define identity, whether it's based on continuity of experience, the persistence of memory, or something deeper and less tangible. In conclusion, the observer fusion paradox is a compelling exploration of the intersection between time loops, consciousness, and identity. It forces us to confront the limits of human experience and the fragility of our sense of self. By imagining a scenario where multiple iterations of a person fuse into one, we can better understand the complexities of time and the profound challenges that such phenomena would pose. Whether viewed as a cautionary tale about the dangers of tampering with time or a thought experiment about the nature of identity, this paradox offers endless possibilities for exploration and reflection. Reality divergence loops are a concept in which each iteration of a time loop differs slightly from the original version, creating a chain of interconnected but unique realities. In this type of scenario, time does not repeat in an identical fashion. Instead, every time the loop restarts, there are small variations that accumulate over iterations. These variations might be as minor as the placement of an object or as significant as a person making a different decision that changes the course of events. Over time, these divergences branch out into an intricate web of possibilities, resembling a multiverse where all iterations coexist. To understand how this works, imagine a simple scenario. A person named Alex finds themselves trapped in a time loop where the day resets every 24 hours. The first time through the loop, Alex wakes up, goes to work, has lunch with a friend, and heads home before the day resets. When the loop begins again, Alex notices something odd. A pen that was on their desk the previous day is now missing. It's a small, almost inconsequential change, but it signals that the loop is not an exact copy of the first iteration. As Alex continues to relive the day, more deviations emerge. The friend they meet for lunch is late, a random stranger bumps into them on the street, or a power outage occurs at work. None of these events are earth-shattering, but they reveal a pattern. The day resets, but the details shift slightly each time. The idea behind these shifts can be rooted in the inherent instability of time loops. In a perfect, fixed loop, events would play out identically every time, with no room for variation. However, if even the smallest factor changes, like a particle moving differently at a quantum level, those changes can cascade into larger differences. This is sometimes referred to as the butterfly effect, where small causes can have large and unpredictable effects over time. For Alex, a single small change, like a misplaced pen, could eventually alter the entire day, leading to drastically different outcomes. The implications of reality divergence loops go far beyond just minor differences. Over a long enough period, the cumulative impact of these divergences can create entirely distinct versions of reality. Imagine Alex reliving the same day hundreds or thousands of times. In one version, they might accidentally cause a car accident. In another, they might save a stranger's life. In yet another, they might decide to quit their job and start pursuing a dream they had previously ignored. Each decision, no matter how small, can create a branching pathway that leads to a new version of the timeline. The further these branches diverge from the original loop, the less recognizable they become compared to the first iteration. This concept raises interesting philosophical questions about identity and choice. If Alex experiences thousands of divergent loops, are they still the same person as they were at the beginning? The cumulative knowledge and experiences of each loop would likely shape their personality, decision-making, and outlook on life. They might begin to see themselves as a collection of many selves, each tied to a different version of the day. In a way, Alex becomes the common thread linking these divergent realities, a single consciousness navigating through countless iterations of the same moment in time. One way to explore the mechanics of reality divergence loops is to consider how they might work in practice. Let's say the divergence occurs because the loop is influenced by the decisions of those trapped within it. If Alex decides to take a different route to work in one iteration, this choice might ripple outward, affecting other people's actions and setting off a chain reaction of changes. Over time, these ripples grow larger, creating a version of the loop where the day looks nothing like the original. For instance, by choosing a different route, Alex might encounter someone they wouldn't have otherwise met, sparking a series of events that alter not just their own life, but the lives of others. In this way, the loop evolves, with each iteration becoming a unique reality. Another possibility is that divergence occurs due to external forces beyond the control of those in the loop. For example, natural phenomena like weather patterns, cosmic events, or even quantum fluctuations could introduce small changes that set each iteration apart. In these cases, the individuals within the loop might not even notice the differences at first. However, as the loop continues, the accumulation of these changes becomes impossible to ignore. Imagine Alex realizing that the position of the sun in the sky is slightly off, or that their friend suddenly remembers events that never happened. These details suggest that the loop is not just replaying a single day, but creating a series of alternate realities, each slightly removed from the one before. The concept of reality divergence loops also opens the door to questions about agency and free will. If each loop creates a new version of reality, does that mean every choice made by Alex is meaningful, even if the day resets? Or are the changes simply a byproduct of a system that Alex cannot control? In some interpretations, the divergence might be seen as a way to break free from the loop. By pushing the boundaries of variation far enough, Alex could potentially create a reality so different that it breaks the cycle entirely, allowing time to move forward again. On the other hand, if the loop is self-sustaining, the divergence might only serve to create more and more branches, trapping Alex in an endless web of possibilities. One way to imagine the structure of these divergent realities is to think of a tree. The original loop is the trunk, a single solid path representing the first iteration. Each divergence creates a branch, splitting off into a new direction. Over time, these branches grow and split further, creating an intricate network of timelines that all trace back to the original loop. This metaphor highlights the interconnected nature of the realities, while also illustrating how far they can drift from their starting point. By the time Alex reaches the outermost branches, the original version of the day might be completely unrecognizable. This structure raises the question of whether all iterations are equally valid. If each loop creates a new reality, does that mean all these realities exist simultaneously? Or does the act of divergence erase the previous version, leaving only the current iteration as real? For Alex, this distinction might not matter in a practical sense. They are experiencing each loop as it happens, and for them, every version feels equally authentic. However, from an outside perspective, the existence of multiple divergent realities could have profound implications for how we understand time, causality, and existence itself. Reality divergence loops challenge the idea of time as a linear, fixed sequence of events. Instead, they suggest that time is more fluid, capable of branching and evolving in response to even the smallest changes. For someone like Alex, being caught in such a loop would be both a curse and an opportunity. On one hand, they are trapped in a cycle of endless repetition, forced to relive the same day over and over. On the other hand, the divergences offer a chance for exploration and growth, allowing Alex to experience countless variations of the same moment and, perhaps, discover a way to break free. In the end, the true significance of reality divergence loops lies in their ability to blur the boundaries between choice and fate. By creating a multiverse of interconnected realities, they remind us that even the smallest actions can have far-reaching consequences. For Alex, the journey through these loops becomes a search for meaning in a world where every iteration is both familiar and completely unique. It's a reminder that even in the face of repetition, there is always the potential for change. Schrodinger's loop presents a fascinating perspective on time loops and their relationship to the concept of choice. This idea stems from Schrodinger's cat, a famous thought experiment in quantum mechanics, which proposes that a cat in a sealed box could be both alive and dead at the same time until someone observes the outcome. In Schrödinger's loop, this principle is extended to time itself. Within the loop, the outcome exists in multiple potential states, all equally valid and possible. The observer's actions determine which of these states becomes the final reality. The loop resolves or persists based on the choices made. Imagine being stuck in a time loop where the same day repeats endlessly. At first, everything seems static. You wake up, live the day, and return to the same starting point when the loop resets. But over time, you notice subtle differences. Perhaps the barista at the coffee shop uses a slightly different tone of voice, or a stranger on the street wears a different hat. The core events remain the same, but small details shift with each iteration. These shifts seem random at first, but they may be influenced by your actions, your perspective, or even your subconscious. Schrödinger's loop suggests that every iteration of the loop contains a branching set of possibilities. Think of it as a deck of cards shuffled anew each time. The major events are fixed, like the presence of the deck itself, but the order in which the cards appear changes. You, as the observer, play a critical role. Each choice you make nudges the deck in a particular direction. You might not see the immediate consequences, but over multiple loops, the pattern becomes clearer. Your actions, no matter how small, influence the outcome, collapsing the wave of possibilities into a single result. Take a simple example. You're in a loop, and every day you encounter a friend who asks for advice on a big decision. On the first day, you dismiss them, too focused on your own predicament to care. On the second day, you try to help, but your advice is vague. Over time, you experiment. You give detailed guidance, emotional support, or even discourage them from making the decision altogether. With each iteration, their response changes slightly. They seem happier, sadder, more determined, or more confused. Eventually, their choice leads to a breakthrough moment, one that alters the structure of the loop itself. Their decision might be the key to resolving the loop, or it could create new complications that deepen your entrapment. The outcome hinges on your choices, creating a direct link between your actions and the ultimate resolution. This dynamic introduces a tension between free will and inevitability. On the one hand, the loop feels like a prison, with events repeating endlessly no matter what you do. On the other hand, Schrödinger's loop suggests that your actions carry weight, even within the constraints of the loop. The paradox is that all outcomes exist simultaneously until you observe or act upon them. This interplay mirrors the uncertainty principle in quantum physics, where particles exist in a state of probability until measured. To explore this further, let's consider a scenario. You're a scientist trapped in a loop caused by a failed experiment. Every day begins with the same problem. The reactor core overheats, threatening to destroy the lab. Initially, you try everything you can think of to stop the meltdown. You shut down the core, reroute the power, or even sabotage the equipment. Nothing works. Each time the loop resets, you're back at square one. Frustrated, you start observing smaller details. You notice that certain variables, temperature fluctuations, energy surges, or even background noise, change slightly with each iteration. These changes seem random, but they align with your actions, however small. Turning a valve a few seconds earlier creates a ripple effect that alters the reactor's behavior. Eventually, you realize the truth. The reactor isn't the problem, the loop is. Your actions are both causing and resolving the loop, creating a feedback cycle that sustains it. Every choice you make collapses one set of possibilities and creates another. The loop exists in a state of quantum flux, simultaneously stable and unstable, until you find the precise combination of actions that resolve it. This realization transforms your approach. Instead of trying to fix the reactor, you focus on understanding the loop itself. You map out the possibilities, exploring every branch of the timeline until you find the path that leads to escape. This process raises profound questions about agency and determinism. If all outcomes exist simultaneously, do your choices truly matter? Schrödinger's loop suggests they do, but only within the framework of the loop. Your actions shape the probabilities, creating a unique path through the maze of possibilities. However, the loop itself may be governed by higher-order rules that remain beyond your control. This interplay creates a dynamic tension where free will operates within the boundaries of a predetermined system. Another layer to consider is the role of memory. In most time loop scenarios, the observer retains their memory of previous iterations, allowing them to learn and adapt. Schrodinger's loop amplifies this concept. Your memory becomes the mechanism by which you influence the loop. Each choice you make is informed by the knowledge gained from prior iterations, creating a cumulative effect. This process mirrors the scientific method, where repeated experimentation leads to a deeper understanding of the underlying system. Let's revisit the scientist in the reactor scenario. Over hundreds of iterations, they develop a detailed understanding of the loop. They learn which actions lead to dead ends and which create new possibilities. They test hypotheses, refine their methods, and gradually narrow down the variables. Each loop brings them closer to the truth, but the final resolution requires a leap of intuition, a moment of clarity where they see the pattern and act decisively. This moment collapses the wave of possibilities into a single outcome, breaking the loop and restoring the normal flow of time. Schrodinger's loop also invites us to consider the psychological impact of such an experience. Repeatedly observing the same events, knowing that every action carries weight, could create immense pressure. The observer must balance the desire to escape with the responsibility of shaping the loop's outcome. Over time, this burden could lead to burnout, despair, or even a sense of detachment. The observer might start to see the loop as a puzzle to be solved rather than a lived experience, losing sight of the human connections that make life meaningful. At its core, Schrodinger's loop is about the interplay between choice and consequence. It challenges us to consider how our actions shape the world, even within the constraints of a seemingly rigid system. By framing the loop as a state of quantum uncertainty, it invites us to explore the boundaries of free will and determinism. The loop is both a prison and a laboratory, a space where infinite possibilities coexist until the observer acts. In the end, Schrodinger's loop offers a powerful metaphor for life itself. Every day, we face a series of choices, each with its own set of possibilities. Our actions shape the outcome, collapsing the wave of uncertainty into a single reality. Like the observer in the loop, we navigate a complex web of cause and effect, seeking meaning and resolution in a world of infinite potential. The morphic resonance loop theory suggests that each iteration of a time loop leaves an imprint on subsequent iterations, creating a subtle yet noticeable influence on outcomes. This idea relies on the notion that events within the loop are not entirely isolated, but instead they are connected by an invisible thread of resonance that carries forward the memory of past iterations. This memory is not conscious or explicit, but manifests in small ways, shaping decisions, behavior, or outcomes in the next loop. Imagine a person trapped in a time loop. Each day begins the same way, and no matter what they do, time resets to the same starting point. At first, they are unaware of this pattern. Their actions are unthinking, following what they believe to be their first encounter with this particular day. But over time, they start to feel an inexplicable familiarity with certain events. They know what someone is going to say before they say it. They avoid taking a particular route without understanding why, only to realize later that it would have led to a dangerous accident. These subtle hints, which they couldn't possibly know in the first iteration, accumulate as echoes of previous loops. This phenomenon can be explained as the subconscious resonance of their actions. Unlike consciously remembering past iterations, this resonance operates beneath the surface of their awareness. It influences decisions and behaviors, nudging them in specific directions without providing a clear explanation as to why. The theory suggests that time loops are not perfect resets, but instead allow residual traces of past events to bleed through into the next cycle. These traces might not include detailed memories or overt knowledge, but they carry enough influence to shape outcomes over time. For example, let's consider a scenario where someone is trying to save a friend from an accident. In the first loop, they have no knowledge of the impending event and fail to act in time. When the loop resets, they feel a strange urgency to be near their friend at a specific moment. They can't explain this feeling, but they follow it, finding themselves in the right place to intervene. Perhaps they still fail in the second loop, but the subconscious resonance pushes them closer to success with each iteration. Over time, they become more attuned to these subtle instincts, learning to trust them even when they don't fully understand their origin. The morphic resonance loop theory also raises interesting questions about free will. If each iteration is influenced by the echoes of previous ones, to what extent are individuals making choices independently? If someone feels compelled to act a certain way without knowing why, is that truly their decision, or is it a result of the resonance from past loops? This creates a paradox, where the person appears to have free will, but is simultaneously guided by forces beyond their conscious understanding. This theory could also explain the phenomenon of déjà vu within a loop. A person might experience a fleeting sense of familiarity when encountering a situation that played out in a previous iteration. While they might not recall the specifics, the resonance triggers a subconscious recognition, leading them to feel as though they've been there before. Déjà vu in this context becomes more than a fleeting feeling. It's a clue to the existence of the loop and a sign of the interconnectedness between iterations. Let's take another example. Imagine someone is attempting to solve a complex puzzle while stuck in a time loop. In the first iteration, they have no idea how to approach the problem. They fumble through random attempts, making little progress, but when the loop resets, they find themselves drawn to certain pieces of the puzzle, instinctively avoiding mistakes they made before. By the 10th iteration, they are solving parts of the puzzle almost automatically, as if they've practiced it countless times. Yet they can't consciously recall those earlier attempts. They simply know what to do. The resonance has built up, guiding their actions in ways they can't fully explain. The idea of morphic resonance loops extends beyond individuals to potentially affect entire systems or groups. Imagine a scenario where a community is stuck in a loop, reliving the same series of events over and over. Each iteration subtly influences the next, not just for individuals, but for the group as a whole. For instance, a recurring disaster might lead people to unconsciously organize themselves better each time, with the community becoming more efficient at responding to the crisis, despite having no explicit memory of previous attempts. Over many loops, the collective resonance could result in significant changes, such as the creation of new habits, systems, or solutions that didn't exist in the first iteration. This phenomenon could also explain why some events in a loop feel inevitable. The resonance from past iterations might reinforce specific outcomes, making them harder to avoid. If someone has failed to escape the loop 100 times before, the subconscious imprint of those failures might create a mental block, making it increasingly difficult to break free. Conversely, if they've come close to success in multiple loops, the resonance might push them toward trying again, even when their conscious mind feels defeated. Interestingly, the morphic resonance loop theory could have implications for how we perceive time and memory outside of fictional time loops. It suggests that even in a linear timeline, there might be invisible connections between events, shaped by the echoes of past actions. While this idea veers into speculative territory, it raises questions about whether our subconscious instincts in daily life could be influenced by similar resonances, albeit on a less dramatic scale. From a scientific perspective, the concept of morphic resonance has parallels in theories of collective memory or field theory. While these ideas are not widely accepted in mainstream science, they provide a framework for understanding how information or behavior might persist across iterations or groups. In the context of time loops, this persistence could explain why each iteration feels slightly different, even when the starting conditions appear identical. The morphic resonance loop theory also has a psychological dimension. Being stuck in a time loop would undoubtedly take a toll on an individual's mental health, particularly if they retain even a faint awareness of past iterations. Subconscious resonance might amplify this strain, as the person feels the weight of countless past decisions influencing their present actions. This could lead to a sense of predestination or helplessness, as they struggle to reconcile their instincts with their conscious desire for control. At the same time, the theory offers a glimmer of hope. If resonance can guide someone toward better outcomes, It implies that even in the most repetitive and frustrating circumstances, progress is possible. Each iteration carries the potential for growth, learning, and improvement, even if it's not immediately apparent. Over time, the resonance might help the individual break free from the loop, either by finding a solution or by reaching a point of acceptance. The morphic resonance loop theory ultimately blends science, psychology, and philosophy to explore the interconnectedness of time, memory, and action. It challenges our understanding of cause and effect, suggesting that even in the most rigidly deterministic scenarios, there is room for subtle influences to shape outcomes. Whether viewed as a narrative device in fiction or as a speculative concept in real-world discussions of time, it opens the door to fascinating possibilities about the nature of repetition and change.